My name is Arthur Milikh. I am the Executive Director of the Claremont Institute's Center for the American Way of Life here in Washington, D.C. We just opened. This is our first major conference. Thank you for coming. Our goal in this center, well, we have a couple, are very simple. Number one, fighting woke doctrines and the institutions that they possess and which they use to impose those doctrines onto the American public. And two, making the right more honest and therefore more useful to the nation, as it is not really currently. Now, as far as I know, this is the first major conference, or among the first, I should say, on the right about woke capital. On the left, of course, they've been having such conferences for decades, hundreds of them, and they've successfully planned their conquest. Which is why they don't really have conferences like this anymore. Now they are in the consolidation stage. They're more concerned with how to keep and deploy their corporate asset. In just 3 generations, America's most powerful corporations went from being more or less patriotic to being globalist, and now to handing out billions of dollars to leftist and even revolutionary causes, and spreading identity politics, or even imposing it. Last year, for example, corporate America gave $5 billion, that's with a B, to BLM, an openly revolutionary organization. And the right's strategy for the past 30 years consisted largely in giving corporate America everything that it wanted: access to the world's markets, to break labor unions, and to sell to and even create adversaries like China, lax border enforcement to allow illegal workers into the country, coupled with high levels of legal immigration and various tax break. The right wrongly bet that by giving away the farm, they would produce loyalty and gratitude. America's corporations got all that they wanted, and then they went woke. Today, much of the establishment on the right still pathetically defends America's corporate titans. While corporations work, willingly or not, to create what looks like a woke oligarchic state with immense moral, financial, and technological power, all set against the American regime, the right points to them and says, look, that's free markets at work. It refuses to see that wokeness did not ascend spontaneously, but occurred based on clever strategies, guilt, was supported by particular laws, and rode in on motives perfectly familiar to free markets: the love of power and avarice. In a different America, this massive accumulation of woke corporate power might have mattered less. But a momentary look at our circumstances shows just how alarming and even dangerous the present arrangement is. In case you haven't noticed, the left almost fully owns the nation's most important, powerful, and prestigious institutions. Much of the press, much of the federal bureaucracy, much of the security state, the universities, K-12, the culture industries, big tech, Fortune 500s, and perhaps even soon the military. And this enormous front, which is currently being used to impose, as I've said, identity politics, the doctrine that so-called oppressors, identified by the color of their skin, must be humiliated, punished, and made to perpetually apologize for the sins of their fathers. The main division today on the right is based on whether you are prepared to accept these outcomes, backpedal and accommodate, or whether you're prepared to push back. So how did we get here? What does it all point to, and what is to be done? These are the questions that our panels today will be answering. On our first panel, who are they? First is David Azerrad, a 2007 Publius Fellow, an assistant professor and research fellow at Hillsdale College's DC campus. Matt Peterson, founding editor of The American Mind and the president of New Founding. Joel Kotkin, my colleague, a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute's Center for the American Way of Life. And Dan McCarthy, also a Lincoln Fellow, editor of Modern Age and director of the Robert Novak Fellowship at the Fund for American Studies. At the end of this panel, we'll have a short Q&A. And after that Q&A, before we get up and adjourn, Chairman Jim Banks will join us for a brief conversation. Thank you very much. David. Okay.
I don't know if you guys read the Babylon Bee, but in the lead up to the last Super Bowl, they ran a story with the following headline. Conservatives sit down for a relaxing evening of being insulted by every major corporation in America. Now, it's funny because it's true. There's a very amusing but also quite insightful Twitter handle called Woke Capital. If you don't follow it, you really should. And the anonymous guy who runs it, who's basically documenting corporate woke propaganda, sat down for an interview a couple years ago and said, "To date, I know of only one publicly traded company where I couldn't find any woke signaling whatsoever." To help you situate the number, there are 3,500 publicly traded companies in America. Big business has gone woke, or as my generation would say, they're actively taking sides in the culture wars. They've joined the media, Hollywood, the universities. Arthur, you left out the mainline Christian churches as reliable allies on whatever the progressive cause du jour may be. Climate change, gun control, and of course, anything having to do with women, so-called people of color, and the so-called LGBTQ. And conservatives and libertarians, for the most part, are really scratching their heads. They're quite perplexed, right? You hear stuff like, surely this can't be good for business. I mean, how many times have you guys heard a conservative say, but didn't Michael Jordan say that, conservatives buy sneakers too? He was referring to in the 90s, Jesse Helm was being challenged by a Democratic incumbent, and pressure was put on Michael Jordan at the time, who was the closest thing to a deity that America had, to endorse the black Democratic challenger. And Jordan in the back of the bus said to Scottie Pippen, Republicans buy sneakers too, and left it at that. And, conservatives say, well, hold on one second. If they buy sneakers, don't they also buy Gillette razors? Don't they shop at Target? Don't they ride Ubers? And don't they fly Delta? Aren't they all going to go broke if they go woke? My thesis is, I believe they may well in the long run, but not for the reasons that those on the right believe to be true. Allow me to explain what I mean by that. And for that, I just want to break down the dynamics of woke capitalism. So let's start by looking at the right. Big businesses don't need to worry about their right flank. First of all, the people who are most offended by wokeness and find it offensive, i.e. the right broadly speaking, we don't boycott. So conservatives and libertarians on a good day mobilize as voters, as donors, as volunteers, and as activists, but very, very rarely as consumers. There are some exceptions. There was a big show of support for Chick-fil-A after they tried to cancel the owners. Target got some pushback after they changed their bathroom policies. But on the whole, if you're a business, it is a safe bet to ignore your conservative consumers. Also, and Arthur touched upon this, the right, and in particular the Republican Party, remains way too libertarian. Most continue to think that the only threats to liberty in America come from the government and assume that corporations are their friends. Now, here's what's interesting. If you look at the woke left and the Democratic Party, it's the exact opposite dynamics. So big business is their friend. Just look at political donations in 2020. But they continue to view them as the enemy and force them to curry favor with them. And then more importantly, they have the woke mobs on their side. Everyone is afraid of the social justice warriors. My friend Darren Beattie, who was a speechwriter in the White House and successfully uncanceled himself, by the way, tweeted last year, "If you go woke, you won't go broke, but if you go anti-woke, you'll get broken." Just think of what would happen to a corporation that decided to say, support the Second Amendment, oppose the chemical castration of children, or deplore the fact that BLM and Antifa burned down 200 American cities last year. Corporate wokeness makes good business sense. You buy off those who would harm you, and you safely ignore those who won't. And these same dynamics apply internally. Remember, if you're a corporation, you're not just afraid of the woke mobs on the outside, you're afraid of your own employees. It was the employees at Mozilla who wanted to cancel Brandon Ike. It was the employees at Google who wanted to cancel James Damore. I have a buddy who has a startup in San Francisco. He's aged 50 years in the past 5 years trying to get this thing off the ground, fundraising, hiring, traveling. He's got 20-year-old twerps scheduling meetings with him saying, you know, I'm concerned about the lack of diversity at the company. And what does he need to do? Nod along, because if he says a word, it's over for him. Think of it this way. Displays of wokeness are a very small price to pay to be otherwise left alone to run your business. Václav Havel, the great Czech dissident, tells the story under Czechoslovakia during communism of a greengrocer who puts up a sign in his grocery store, "Workers of the world unite." And he puts it up not because he's a believing communist, but because he wants to be left alone to do his business. At the deepest level, displays of wokeness allow corporations and the oligarchs who run them to morally launder their privilege, their wealth, and their corporate nature. So in a democracy, you need to justify inequalities. They inevitably arouse suspicion. If all of us are equal, then why is it that some people have so much money and so much power? Now, all of you will yell out and say, we know the answer, meritocracy. If you work hard and you save and you have a good idea and you develop a good product, you can get ahead. Now, that used to be the answer in America, and it still resonates with those on the right. Regrettably, the left has dealt way too many blows to the idea of meritocracy for it to still be a convincing narrative in the public square. I think Rawls is most responsible for this. You see it, for example, today in the idea that in America today, we call, good fortune, good birth, and hard work the result of privilege. And so basically, Ayn Rand's poetry no longer speaks to us. And this is where social justice comes in handy. If you hold the right opinions on the most pressing social justice issues of the day, if you donate a bit of money, which by the way is a tax write-off, and if you do a handful of strategic diversity hires that you park in your cost centers, you can legitimize your privilege and become one of the good guys. So Jeff Bezos is not an oligarch who underpays his workers and uses unfair business practices to squeeze out the competition. He's a supporter of racial justice. So think of it this way. The more we talk about racial justice, the less we talk about inequality, oligarchy, and corporate power. Corporate America is afraid of Occupy Wall Street. They are not afraid of Black Lives Matter. They're afraid of Bernie Sanders. They're not afraid of Kamala Harris. Why? Because BLM and Kamala Harris can be bought off. So it all seems like the perfect system. Businesses are masquerading as NGOs, and in exchange, they get to make obscene amounts of money and claim the moral high ground. But, and this is my thesis this morning, the corporations who go woke, even performatively, are playing with fire. Wokeness and capitalism can be superficially and temporarily harmonized, but they're ultimately in fundamental contradiction with one another. If you go fully woke, you will eventually go broke. Now, whether they admit it or not, corporations have to turn a profit. And as long as we retain some degree of market freedom in America, companies that don't do well will go out of business and be replaced by competitors. With the exception, perhaps, of the most entrenched monopolies, i.e. Google, they need to remain concerned about efficiency and profitability. The wokies, by contrast, not only don't care one bit about efficiency and profitability, they're actively opposed to each one. What they want is to redistribute power and honor to their preferred victim groups, you know the list, and to punish the oppressors, straight white men. They don't care about qualifications. They just want the good positions to go to people of the right skin color, sexual orientation, gender identity, and race. Now, for the time being, they're bought off with the symbolic displays of wokeness. But what happens when the wokies start demanding diversity, not in the cost centers, HR, marketing, but in the profit centers, engineering, sales, and product development? It is a fact in America that there is a more limited supply of qualified, diverse candidates, especially for senior management or technical positions. We don't like to hear this, we don't like to admit this, but the fact remains that the supply is limited, whatever the reasons may be, and they're complex. But even if you assume the woke reason, that America is racist and preventing blacks and women's and Hispanics and transgender people from getting engineering degrees, there are simply not enough female engineers, black lawyers, and Hispanic CEOs to meet the diversity expectations imposed on all corporations. How long can you keep a company running if you're hiring subpar people? How long can you hire subpar people before the quality of your products start to deteriorate? You also need to remember that the zealous wokies are staunchly anti-capitalist. So BLM right now is happy with the flag and a little payoff here and there. Go to their website. They want, quote, a radical and sustainable redistribution of wealth. A simpler word for that in English is called expropriation. They also want government and corporate reparations. They're not just anti-capitalist, they're anti-science. Because blacks do not excel in the hard sciences, the only possible explanation in America today, because you remember, if there's one thing we are never allowed to do, is to ascribe any agency to victim groups. We have to attack science itself as being racist. Examples are a dime a dozen. I'll just share one quote with you, and this is not some weirdo anonymous Twitter guy. He's the head of the graduate program at the University of Rhode Island. Science, statistics, and technology are all inherently racist because they're developed by racists who live in a racist society, whether they identify as racist or not. Think through the implications of this statement. What will happen if, or should I say when, this way of thinking comes to dominate aeronautics, or oncology, or any other field where the demands of wokeness are contradicted by physical reality? What happens when the boomers and the Xers start to retire, and the corporations are now run by the millennials and the Zoomers who got college as the woke madrasa experience? I don't have the answer to these questions, but I'm growing more and more pessimistic that those in charge will muster the courage to put down the fanatics. I want to end by quoting the most overquoted book on the right, 1984. Everyone remembers this one, but they don't remember the corollary. 2 + 2 = how much according to the party? 5. And because the party has all the power and everyone is afraid of them, no one contradicts them, and Big Brother says 2 + 2 = 5, and it turns out that it equals 5. There's one exception. Physical facts could not be ignored. In philosophy or religion or ethics or politics, 2 and 2 might make 5. But when one was designing a gun or an aeroplane, they had to make 4. Inefficient nations were always conquered sooner or later, and the struggle for efficiency was inimical to illusions. What will happen for America to give up its illusions? Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to talk about 2 causes that need to be addressed when we look at what is woke capital and why did capital go woke. The first, because I'm a recovering political scientist, is legal, political, and the other is what I'll call economic and cultural. First, who are we talking about? Let's distinguish between how people commonly just talk about this. On the one hand, there's the zealots, right? Identity politics, whatever you want to call it, multiculturalism, wokeness, and all it represents, kind of racial tribalization, destruction of the family, replacement of religion, a new notion of justice ordered around kind of racial hierarchies. I mean, that's one group. It seeks, and I think is well on its way towards accomplishing a fundamental regime change. As the Claremont Institute has said for a long time, it constitutes a rejection of the principles of the Declaration, replacing equality with equity, quote unquote, and therefore the structure of the Constitution. Second, most people have in their minds kind of elite opportunists or those who simply go along with the flow. So at the same time as the zealots push their ideology, you have a tightening one-party oligarchy that is designated woke capital. It crushes dissent, it gets involved in election law, and it's rapidly asserting itself in some way. And you can argue about the relationship between those 2 groups, but I think for our purposes, we don't need to do that. That's just a game of inches. Now, All of the above is unfolding, and this is something the right never talks about and should, as digital technology is fundamentally disrupting both human behavior and institutions globally. I mean, that's a rolling revolution that's been going on for some time. So the shift in the American cultural and political landscape since the end of World War II has been enormous, right? And the gap between the experience of those 70 plus and those younger is now, I think, a dangerous chasm of disparate experience and really alternative realities that people live in. And a big alternative vision is the understanding of business and what it is. So how did this happen? And now first, Claremont has talked about this for a long time, but probably one of the most provocative and engaging presentations of this argument in recent memory is Chris Caldwell's book, The Age of Enlightenment, America Since the 60s. And we have to first acknowledge that the zealots, quote unquote, have law on their side. We're not just talking about a raging radical leftist ideology. We're talking about a political legal complex that has been progressing for decades and is now firmly entrenched throughout the federal government, in blue states as well as red states, that continuously pushes for woker and woker business. We have to be honest about this. That political legal regime emerged somehow from the Civil Rights Act and anti-discrimination law. I mean, long before the current round of wokeness, affirmative action required race consciousness rather than color blindness. Long before the last 10 years. As Caldwell says in his book, just half a decade into the civil rights revolution, America had something it never had at the federal level, something the overwhelming majority of its citizens would never have approved, an explicit system of racial preferences. So, while it may be uncomfortable to confront, let me suggest that woke capital arises out of a legal regime, an HR regime that developed over decades according to a logic that has been around for decades. And if we're just now realizing this, that's on us. And I mean, let me say a few words about this. I think it's important to confront because there's a certain denial that people have been living in for some time. About this issue, pretending, for instance, that affirmative action doesn't require a kind of color consciousness, as we say. And you see this in corporations, in fact, when you look at employees. When the first round of all this comes to you, you see I know many managers, talk to people throughout the country about this over the last couple of years. The first reaction is, for many Americans, is to think, well, this is about equality, right? I'm not a racist. I believe in equality under law, and I think we should help people of all kinds. And there's a denial that's helped by this layer of rhetoric that we need to jettison after decades of it metastasizing into what we face now. Second, let me reverse the problem. The problem isn't merely legal, and if we got rid of all the laws, per impossibile right now, all the laws, we just got rid of them, right? It wouldn't matter because the wokeness is entrenched in people's hearts and minds. It's the way, in fact, that we do business. It's the way we advertise. It relates to a way of life, right? I mean, there's a flag, for instance, a rainbow flag. It's a political way of life that we advertise products and services based upon. So, how did this happen? Let me suggest another uncomfortable truth. Traditionally, the right has treated business as outside of politics, right? Such that people on the right are supposed to act in a neutral or apolitical way when they go to the workplace. And this, of course, all but guaranteed the left, which did not treat business this way, would win. So this is a failure, really, to understand the political issues at play when it comes to business. It's a philosophical error. It's an error about how culture and government operates. And it's an odd one, really, because in many ways it's so farcical. But why did we think this? Why did we think that government could be divorced from politics in this sort of libertarian way? Well, I think to what David was saying, I mean, there was a time when you could say, right, what's good for Ford is good for America, and it made sense. It made sense because of some kind of national consensus or some kind of shared vision of the good life or the ways of life. But now, of course, that's laughable if you put it in a current context. So if I say to you, what's good for Google good for America? A lot of people in the room are going to smile and nod and shake their head, right? So how do we get here? I mean, the only thing that can be said for this impoverished apolitical understanding is that it's based on an old view of how business operates as well. There was some kind of consensus that seemed like what's good for Ford was good for America because Ford was making its products here. This is pre-globalization. And also the vision of what capital was, of what business was very different than today's current reality. So one note that, say, the gentleman to my left, Joel Kotkin, makes in his paper is that companies, they had to deal then with a diversity of small shareholders. Right? Households in 1960 accounted for 90% of all corporate equity. That percentage is now barely 1/3. So what the thing has changed. It's become more elite. You have concentrated decision-making held in an ever smaller number of hands that does not represent the rest of the country. You also, of course, have the troubling fact that we haven't really grappled with, that a lot of these companies are not owned by what still many Americans believe business to be, right? A number of men sitting around the table in the boardroom back in the 1950s with the good of the long-term good of the company in mind, right? They're in fact owned by larger companies who aren't thinking about those sorts of things at all. Okay, so that's our scene. Now consider how the left deals with politics. You could make a quote-unquote conservative case, the one that David was mocking, and you could say, well, look, half the country is one way, half the country is another, so it's good business to stay out of politics. Listen to how today's CEOs speak about this. Here's Nike co-founder Phil Knight, quote, "It doesn't matter how many people hate your brand, as long as enough people love it. You have to take a stand on something, which is ultimately, I think, why the Colin Kaepernick ad worked." Can you imagine a single CEO saying the same thing about an issue leaning right? Let's take the owner of Dove Soap, Breyers Ice Cream, Unilever. Listen to this. He said, "You cannot be absolutely relevant for one segment in this increasingly polarized world. You can't be relevant for one segment in this increasingly polarized world without accepting that it's not going to be the message that other segments want to hear. I really profoundly believe that seeking this mushy middle ground, that's not how the world is anymore." Again, can you imagine one CEO on the right saying that? How about PG&E CEO when you remember the Gillette razor ad, toxic masculinity? If anyone remembers this, the razor ad was controversial. And he was asked, how do you intend to win back the consumer base you've spent the better part of the year offending? And this is what he said. He said, "People of all ages expect a brand to take a stand. Our intent is to echo positive values. Not everybody will like every ad." You could argue, and you'd be correct, I think, that part of the reason you don't have anyone, on the other side saying something similar is because they would be torn apart in public, in part by other companies and governmental powers. Everyone has seen companies like Parler be drawn and quartered in public. But part of it, let me suggest, is there's a problem in the very way in which the right has conceived of business over the last few decades. In any event, Joel also quotes from American Prospect as a great line in his piece, where they say the Chinese Communist Party figured out that corporations and individuals, not the government, control nearly everything in America. And so if you change them, you change everything else. This is not the way the right has traditionally thought. But let me suggest that political science notwithstanding, many of the most significant battles right now, politically, are being fought within business, with particularly technology and media. That is effectively a battleground. And that really, it's only a matter of time if you're holding out, right? You don't want to go public and take a stand. It's only a matter of time before the wokeness that comes for you. So there's no escape from that. And so maybe more controversially, I'd like to end just with a few thoughts, even though we're talking about what's wrong with how we might counter this. It can't be through revisions to law alone. And it's unlikely that one or two big CEOs come out and takes a stand. And if they do, it's really unlikely that it matters very much. It's clear what's already happened. It's clear what's already established. But let me suggest that new companies, founded by people who understand the moment, might in fact gain a hell of a lot of traction right now. I know that many people think, they're sort of doomers about this, so there's nothing that can be done. But I would say that right now we see millions of people in America actually taking action related to products and services in a way that's astounding. I mean, it's astounding that millions of people go through the hassle of leaving Facebook as their natural reaction to what happened in November. And yes, Parler was destroyed in front of the world, but there's lots of ways to skin the cat. And there's lots of people right now, especially in tech and media, who understand the moment and actually want to build something new. And so let me end with this. The right was wrong about business being neutral, I think, in this way. Products and services are built, they're sold around a kind of way of life that isn't expressly political in the sense most people understand the word. Right? It's not Trump on a tank or red or blue. But when you think about how you buy products and how you look at what's sold to you, it very much relates to certain paths, certain ways of life, certain attitudes of being as opposed to others. What does the right present to the American people in terms of a way of life? What does the right offer other than being anti-wokeness? This is something that needs to be built. This is a new, really an entirely new ecosystem of businesses that needs to be fostered, especially in tech and media. And that's why myself and others have created this alliance called New Founding. Thank you.
All right, first of all, just get ready for something different. Basically, I'm not a conservative, so I'm coming at this from probably, in some odd ways, more of a left or Marxist perspective than you might expect. Just so you know, I was brought up in a fairly liberal household. I went to Berkeley, and I was a protege of the late Mike Harrington. So just to start with that. But I don't think it means that I differ a great deal with what's been said before. I'm not so interested in reviving the right, but I am interested in responding to what I think is autocracy. And so my biggest instinct is always to fight against autocracy, so that's why I'm here today, and I'm working with Arthur. One of the things that's clearly changed, and that I think the speakers before have gotten into this quite well, is that we now are seeing this redefinition of what the role of companies is. Are they profit making and they're going to come and they're going to go, and they're sort of value neutral? And from the social democratic perspective is, yeah, they're value neutral. They play a role. They create prosperity, and when they go off the rails, we regulate them. That was a reasonable response, I think, over time. We've sort of gotten away from that. I want to go a little bit into what the parallels are of what we're seeing today with what is happening elsewhere. First of all, and I'll get into this a bit, we're really evolving quite a bit into something very much like China. As we compete with China, we become more like them. Now, that's probably good from a gastronomic point of view, but outside of that, I'm not so happy about it. Deng Xiaoping, I've been going to China for 40 years, and, and I have to admit, I have astounded by the changes. I mean, you do not understand what's happened if you haven't seen it over this long period of time. But his idea was, he said, we're developing socialism with Chinese characteristics, which means we can cheat. And we can actually, Chinese people are very entrepreneurial people. We're going to take advantage of that. Chinese moms want their kids to do really well. We're going to take advantage of that. So the United States is now doing something that increasingly resembles Chinese capitalism with American characteristics. And I'll get into what those characteristics are. But it's a similar drive towards autocracy and control from above. To give you some numbers, because I think we'll talk a little bit about the economy, the concentration of industry and finance since the 1990s, a tenth of the U.S. economy is made up of areas where 4 firms dominate more than 2/3 of the market. Finance, information, technology among the most concentrated. Financial sector. I remember when there were small banks all over this country where they had relations with local people. Some of them were ethnic banks. The most recent numbers in the percentage of deposits in the largest commercial banks in the United States was 15% in 1984. It's 44% today. It's a 3-fold increase. Local banks have simply disappeared. These were little centers of intelligence and civic culture, and they went from 11,000 in 1983 to barely 4,000 in 2018. So let's just say that there's a bit of a anti-small business pogrom going on of sorts. Okay, then the most frightening is what the speakers have raised, the concentration of technology and social media firms. I'm old enough to remember the early days of Silicon Valley, which were very exciting, about all sorts of diversity, we're going to empower people like we've never seen before, and the consumer is going to be in the lead, and all this stuff you read back from, my friend, the late Al Toffler, he wrote about these things. There was an excitement, and there was, and I think it was understandable. But what do we have now? We have a few companies that completely dominate almost all the major sectors. There's a handful of companies that are about 40% of the Standard & Poor's. That's unprecedented concentration. The pandemic has been extraordinarily good for this tech oligarchy. The blog, The Bellows, I do follow sometimes some Marxist blogs a bit, tripled its profits, and Jeff Bezos made $70 billion. I guess he's got to share that with his wife or ex-wife. And the billionaires earned over $1 trillion since March. In 2020, the top 7 tech firms added $3.4 trillion in value. So this is a direct danger to democracy. You don't have to be a conservative to feel this way. Traditionally, the way I was brought up, more on the left, was concentrations of power are dangerous. You can go back to British theory back in even before the Revolution. But it was Brandeis, Supreme Court Justice Brandeis, who said, we can have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth concentrated in the hands of a few. We can't have both. And I think he was completely correct. The reality is we are in a situation which is, with President Biden, sort of the springtime for oligarchs. There'll be talk about, oh, we're going to break them up. Believe me, this administration is so packed with people who have represented, worked for, gotten contributions from the oligarchs that they're not going to limit Google. They're not going to break up Facebook. I don't think it's going to happen. So where did this thesis that companies would line up with government in this way in very large concentrations? And I think, you know, the first really good example of this that I found, looking at it historically, was from Italy under Mussolini. Mussolini, you know, we think of him as kind of a buffoon today, but actually from a philosophical point of view, he was actually fairly sophisticated. And his notion was that you would have an alliance of the large property owners with the state. And as long as the property owners and the big industrial groups followed what the state wanted, he was fine with it. This is very much like what you see in China. You know, China, the companies are expected to act in the national interest. You talk about globalism. They believe in globalism as in conquering the globe. That's what globalism is in China. When companies steal technology from Western companies, they're called patriotic thieves. And the idea is that they are going to promote the prosperity of the Chinese people, not necessarily just for that one reason, but this is the way the Communist Party stays in power. I mean, this has been the pattern of Chinese history from the beginning. So they also know that the U.S. is completely not going to do anything about it. And actually, big corporate America is probably the biggest handmaiden that they have. You know, you get Michael Bloomberg, who increasingly symbolizes what the Democratic Party has become, as this is a description of China: ecologically friendly, democratically accountable, and invulnerable to the threat of revolution. And by the way, Xi Jinping is not a dictator, just so you know. In the U.S., it's a different story. It's not the government on top, it's the corporations on top. And their role in creating the present administration. I mean, let's face it, the heart of the Democratic Party wanted Bernie Sanders, and that part of the heart that didn't want Bernie Sanders wanted Elizabeth Warren, and they got Joe Biden. And if you want to understand how that happened, you have to understand the politics of fundraising, and you also have to understand, as was mentioned earlier, you know, the Jeff Bezoses of the world do not like the Bernie Sanders of the world. So I think we have an oligarchy like the one in China, but the bad part of it is that they're not interested in national interests. Our companies are simply interested in using China and using China's production to get things done. They're not also particularly interested in creating employment. Just to give you an idea, in Silicon Valley today, roughly 40% of the employees are either H-1Bs or some other form of indentured servant. So and I ask students of mine, well, you know, you're from San Jose. Did your friends from San Jose get jobs in Silicon Valley? They said, generally not. These companies really now justify themselves not as the old corporations, we provide jobs, we provide opportunity. That's not really the big interest anymore. What they do is they say, okay, we can get PR brownie points. This was very well explained, so I'm not going to go over it again. But by embracing draconian climate policies, if you're a high-tech company, you can make a fortune investing in solar and wind, guaranteed profits, and it doesn't affect your business at all. It does affect, obviously, other people's business. You have these corporate struggle sessions, like something out of, if you read the book about the Cultural Revolution, the world turned upside down, it's remarkably similar to what you had in China, although I guess we don't have to wear dunce caps or get beaten up yet. The company, what is the war corporation? And to me, it's a bargain between the progressive clerisy, the academics, the media, and the upper bureaucracy, and the tech oligarchy, and with their running dog friends in Wall Street. You know, you genuflect to the cause of the month, and then you get a pass. And you're also getting a pass from your own people. I think this was mentioned as well. I spoke with Jim Wunderman, who's the head of the Bay Area Council. Jim used to work for Senator Feinstein in California. And I said, Jim, why are they going along with this stuff? And he said, they're scared shitless of their own employees. That's what's driving it. That they cannot handle 115 people in their company who are going to protest something. By the way, one of the biggest problems, I did a podcast with a venture capitalist the other day, which I found painful to do in some ways. These are the most ignorant people in terms of the Constitution, history, philosophy, religion, than you could ever find. As a friend of mine who's the largest apartment developer in Silicon Valley said, I have never run into a group of people who are more ignorant about the impact of what they're doing than these people. They're nerds. They're very good at certain kinds of things, but they're not really thinking about the implications. They're not interested particularly in grassroots capitalism. Actually, they want to keep things pretty much the way they are. And they, of course, have the help of the libertarian useful idiots who will get there and say, well, you know, it's all, you know, we can't approach Facebook because it's a private company. You have to understand what these people are about. Greg Ferenstein did a really good series, 147 interviews with digital company founders. And what he came back with was they believe that the share of economic wealth will be generated by an ever smaller group of people, and everyone else will live on gig work and government aid. That's the future that's being pressed. The idea is that we will be able to get to what I call oligarchical socialism. In other words, we're seeing this in California right now. The vast majority of this enormous surplus we have from the IPOs, it's not going to go to luring an auto plant to Fresno. It's not going to go to helping start up a whole series of new businesses. It's going to go into people's pockets and subsidize their rents so that they are consistently tied into the state, and that they don't have any reason to want to improve their own lives, getting more independent. This in a state, just to give you an idea, where 80% of all the new jobs over the last decade paid under the median income, and half of those paid under 40,000. So what you end up with is a society in which there is a oligarchy, a well-financed clerisy, which is largely government employees and academics and the media, and then you've got this vast group where there used to be a middle class, you now have increasingly a serf class. These people believe in what Huxley called a scientific caste system. By the way, I would argue that the book to read is not 1984, but Brave New World. Brave New World is where we're headed. And Huxley, who lived in LA, I think got it the best. So what is the world that we're going to create? It's going to be a world where the masses, I studied Latin for 6 years. You know, my mom used to say to me, what are you trying to become Pope? And I said, well, the first Pope was Jewish. So, but what we're having is we're going to have bread and circuses. You know, our next generation not going to have kids. They're going to live in little apartments. It's going to be subsidized, and they can smoke pot, drink, water their plants, and play video games, and be involved in what Google likes to call immersive computing. And that's going to be really great. So what we really need to do is say, what can we do about it? Because everyone sort of tries to deal with it on one level or another. Well, I think there are some opportunities. One, the move on the rapid decarbonization is going to create an enormous impact in the middle of the country, and I think there's going to be a lot of anger about it. We already have a lawsuit, which I've been helping with, by 200 civil rights leaders in California to say that the current climate policies are completely discriminatory to minorities and the poor. And I think, as you suggest, you keep giving in to this logic of the woke, and it's going to bite you back. You know, I saw there was they wrote about it, I wrote this before there, but this whole idea of fully automated luxury communism. That's really what they're going to face with. You know, AOC and Bernie Sanders don't believe that there should be billionaires. So sooner or later, there's going to be a move on their wealth, and I think that that's going to be useful. So what can we do about it? Okay. I think there are a few major things to look at. One is to come up with a program that, like the New Deal, was about expanding ownership and productivity. You can disagree about the New Deal. but its goals were in harmony with a lot of the population, and I think a lot of the things left over, like the TVA, were incredibly positive. That there was the belief in owning a home. That's something that the progressives don't want, that the people want. So there has to be an alliance developed, and this is where I'll just end up with. There has to be an alliance based between people like you who have woken up from your libertarian dogmatic slumbers and want to reach out to this new constituency, but you've got to be able to have a direct contact with it. So I would argue that what you really need to do is have a room that looks very different than this one, a panel that looks different from this one, and you know, I'm perfectly happy to stay in California and not get on a plane. But the reality is you've got to have direct contact with unions, but particularly the private sector unions, some of the traditional liberals who are very upset by where the wokes are leading us, and by minorities. If you're going to make the Republican Party a working class party, remember by 2030, 50% of the working class will be black or Hispanic, basically. This alliance is possible, but you're going to have to bring people in. Like I think, you know, the Industrial Areas Foundation, for instance, used my book on feudalism as a textbook for their organizers. That's a break. That's a move into a group that was the Saul Alinsky group, who now realize that the wokes really aren't offering them very much. I think we need to be able to also be very firm that, and I know this is probably going to piss people off, you got to get rid of Trump. You just can't. As long as you have Trump around you, his constituency is getting smaller, and you're not going to be able to communicate well with millennials and minorities on a big basis that you need if you're going to continue to back Trump. I don't see where that gets you anywhere. But I do think that Trump had some good points, and one of the key points is there is a potential coalition among minorities, among working class people, among middle class people that want to restore the American dream to something that we all understood. You can be a New Deal Democrat, or you could be a Eisenhower Republican, or you could be a Taft Republican and still believe in essentially the same thing. We have to be able to figure out how do we get a working coalition of people who share those values together. Thank you.
Well, my remarks will pull together a number of threads that have been brought out by other speakers. I fear my remarks might even seem a little pessimistic, but I will in fact propose something of a solution, at least as a segue to our next panel. First of all, this revolution of wokeness is built upon a change which has been taking place over the course of the last century. And this is somewhat alluded to in Joel Kotkin's fantastic report that has just been published. But you've had a transformation in American business which really goes back at least to the 1930s, probably as far back as the First World War. It's something that has been alluded to by thinkers such as in the 1930s, Adolf Berle, and in the 1940s by James Burnham, in the 1960s by John Kenneth Galbraith. What it is a change from our sort of traditional and perhaps even partly hackneyed view of businesses as a complex of ownership and labor to what has to be, I think, a more sophisticated and accurate view of a third element within the corporate structure. And this is the layer which begins as management, but today has become not just administration, but even a kind of commissar bureaucracy. And the original sort of managerial class that someone like James Burnham was talking about in the 1940s, they were people who had tremendous logistical abilities. They came in and they organized corporations on a vastly larger scale than had existed during the sort of golden age of capitalism in the 19th century. There were many sort of real-world talents that the managers of the early part of this revolution brought to bear. What we've seen, however, over the past several decades is the development of this new bureaucratic and administrative layer within the corporate world, which is far less talented and far less productive. And it is in part a creation of government. It has certainly been encouraged by government by the fact that there are, sort of more and more regulations for corporations to comply with, and that means they need to have compliance officers. The rise of the HR establishment, the Human Resources Department within corporations, this too has been incentivized by government, although it's not entirely a product of government influence. And I think you also see the increasing role of public relations and communications, that basically propaganda departments within the corporate world have become not only more and more important within corporations, but are plugged into a wider propaganda meta-narrative, which you also find in the mainstream media and in so many of our institutions, including government, including woke activists, including social media. So this development of a new layer, which is neither labor nor capital, is of tremendous significance for the direction that our firms take. That they're no longer simply concerned with maximizing profit. They're now concerned with all of these other foci which have come about through this intermediate layer of bureaucracy, of basically commissars within the corporations. This layer can be understood in part with reference to what the economist Vilfredo Pareto identified as a power rule, as something which is a general pattern one finds replicated in many kinds of societies and many kinds of human gatherings. And the power rule, in this case, applies to saying that perhaps if you look at a firm, something like 20% of the employees probably generate about 80% of the value of that company. And this is not an entirely new thing, but it seems to me that the rise of woke bureaucracy within corporate America is feeding upon this power rule. So to answer one of the mysteries that was brought up by David Azerrad, how can you possibly have corporations that are still profitable, that are still viable, if they are full of these ideologues and zealots who are pushing woke ideology? Well, the way they're able to do it is precisely because even going back before the age of wokeness and before the age of ideological zealotry, it was probably the case that about 20% of the employees of a firm were generating 80% of the value. And the other 80% of the firm's employees, they do generate some value, but they are generating so much less of it that there is much more room to give them busy work or to give them projects that are not directly related to creating products, creating things that consumers want to consume. And this, I think, is where you see ideology colonizes business, that it's able to take hold within this layer of bureaucracy, and it's able to take bureaucracy, which is normally a very sleepy and sort of rather unexciting and perhaps even amoral kind of pursuit. It's simply filling out paperwork. And it's able to invest bureaucracy with a searing and searching moral mission. It's able to invest bureaucracy with a kind of dignity that it otherwise would not possess. And in fact, wokeness tends to imbue business as a whole, even the productive elements, with this sense of great sort of moral excitement, which otherwise is largely absent from the ethos of the businessman. And that, I think, is going to be one of the most profound sort of psychological drivers of the woke insurgency within corporate America. I should point out, by the way, that I think our moral senses are often more engaged by injustice than they are by justice. And this is sort of fateful and has tremendous implications for what's happening right now. The reason for this is that injustice tends to excite our sense of courage. Injustice gives us a sense, well, somebody's being oppressed, we must therefore go to the rescue, and getting in the middle of a fight of any kind requires the virtue of justice, or rather requires the virtue of courage. Whereas when you simply have a situation where you are being benevolent and just to people, that doesn't quite engage courage in the same way. So think about the tremendous virtue of charity. When you are working in a soup kitchen and giving soup to homeless people, that's wonderful, it makes you feel good about yourself, but it's not going to get the blood pumping in your veins the way that going out there and protesting in the street against some kind of injustice will do so. So if you want to quicken the pulse, if you want to add an element of excitement to a life that has otherwise become rather boring and complacent, both in the business community and perhaps in America at large, these ideological narratives of oppression are tremendously powerful, and they engage people in exactly the way in which people are looking for causes to be engaged with. And the fact that the right has not been able to engage in the same way is one of its profound weaknesses and is one of the things that has allowed wokeness to go as far as it has. Now, I referred to this power rule, this idea that perhaps 20% of a firm's employees generate 80% of its value. When you are a new employee first coming to a company out of college, chances are you are inevitably almost going to be part of the 80% that only produces the 20% of the value. Why is that? Well, first of all, because you are inexperienced. And you would expect that as you gain more experience, you will become a more valuable employee. Second, there is a talent distribution, and the number of people who are extremely talented, who are sort of geniuses as young people, is relatively limited, and you would expect that to be, maybe at an optimistic count, 20% of the population as opposed to a much larger group like an 80%. So when you have young people who've just been coming out of colleges where they have engaged in a lot of sort of woke activism probably within their extracurricular activities, and where their classes themselves have often involved a great deal of woke ideology, and where the university administration, through its residential plans and through its propaganda, has created a sense of urgent, sort of woke causes on campus, even apart from what the students themselves are doing. When these young people come to corporate America, they wind up specializing in a kind of moral extortion over the people who are actually more talented than they are and the people who are more experienced than they are. So you come to a corporation, you have your liberal arts degree, or you have your degree perhaps in women's studies or something else, and the question is, what value are you to this corporation that you've entered into? You don't have the technical skills that the very few people have. You don't have the level of experience that the senior management has. But what you can claim to have that no one else is able to compete with you about is this keen moral sensibility that you have derived directly from your college experience. And this is why you see, I think, the younger employees in so many of these corporations, and the employees who are less attached to actual value creation, are often the ones driving the woke agenda. It's not just because they are naturally the most woke, it's really because this is the kind of niche they can create for themselves within the bureaucracy that exists within the business community. It is how they create value, or the impression of value, within themselves. And it's how they justify their existence and justify their role in a corporate America which otherwise may find them rather superfluous. The question, however, is why the senior management goes along with this. Why do people who have real talent or people who have real experience submit themselves to the extortion coming from these young woke employees? Now, there are many layers to this onion, and some of it is a matter of sheer power being exerted by, for example, woke capital itself at the very heights of the financial chain. If you have a company like BlackRock, for example, saying if you want to get a capital infusion from us, you have to obey these certain woke commandments. That, of course, these carrots and sticks, these punishments and incentives can get people to align with the woke agenda. But I think there's an element, too, of actual voluntary acquiescence. And where does this voluntary acquiescence come from? Well, it comes from the desire that all human beings feel to be proud of themselves and to feel as if they are good people. And so if you are able to manipulate the narratives that justify or that define what goodness is, especially in the sense of fighting against injustice, you are therefore able to manipulate and pull over magnetically so many people who want to feel a greater degree of excitement, a greater degree of moral commitment within their lives than their mere activities as businessmen would allow them to engage in. Now, businessmen have virtues, and they have virtues that are peculiar to themselves, and those virtues are not to be dismissed or looked at lightly. Many of the virtues of the businessmen, however, are what might be considered amoral virtues, or virtues that do not involve conflict. They, in fact, involve avoiding conflict or resolving conflict. So the advantages of a commercial society, historically, are thought to be things like a commercial society will be tolerant. The businessman is not going to want to exclude customers, regardless of whatever their personal background may be, their race or their sexual orientation or their religion. The businessman is going to be neutral about that, in theory, and at least in the ideal. He's going to want to sell to every possible consumer. The businessman is also going to encourage a society which is dedicated towards prosperity and towards peace. And the values that are conducive to that, the virtues that are conducive to that, are rather different from some of the older virtues that we see during the Christian era and during the classical world. So you tend to see within a commercial society a downgrading of such virtues as courage and the virtues that involve conflict and hard choices as opposed to reconciliations and an ability to bring together opposites. So the bourgeois virtues, the virtues of the businessman, are very considerable, they're very good, and yet they also have certain limitations in terms of their appeal to the human psyche. They do not appeal to what is highest in the human spirit. They do not appeal to this, this desire to not just have a good system, not just have virtue, not just have a kind of a kindly outlook on other people, and not just have a peaceful society, but to have a society that is actually heroic, and to have a sense of engagement against injustice, and to be fighting against evil. The woke narrative is something that allows businessmen to indulge in the fantasy of being engaged in a life and death, sort of existential struggle against oppression and injustice. And if you think about it, I mean, businessmen have always been somewhat vulnerable to these kinds of moral crusades, but in the past, several factors have tended to limit this vulnerability. So if you think about the rise of commercial society and the business world in the first place, it was tied in with the idea of class struggles between capital and labor, and also between the rising capitalist class and the old aristocracy. And this kind of struggle back in the 19th century and really up until World War I added a moral dimension to the capitalist and the businessman's life, which was very elevating. And then after that, as you get into the Second World War and beyond that, the Cold War, there continues to be a sense of moral elevation to the struggle of the businessman and the capitalist, because of course the Cold War was being fought against communism, which existed in order to dismiss both Christianity and also the capitalist ethos and the capitalist practice. And so the businessman, by being an element within the Cold War, could feel as if he was a warrior against a certain kind of injustice and a certain evil that existed outside in the form of communism. And I would say even for 10 or 15 years after the end of the Cold War, there was still a sense of moral elevation that the businessman could feel based on the sort of afterglow of the Cold War struggle. And this was seen, for example, in the idea that our commercial relations with China would naturally lead China to follow the same path as the Soviet Union towards collapse or towards profound reform that would do away with communist tyranny. And again, for about 10 or 15 years, businessmen could believe that. They could actually think, yes, that simply by having relations with China, by moving manufacturing over there, by providing cheap consumer goods to more Americans, we are also helping to end communist tyranny within China and to bring about a world that is much more profoundly just than the one that exists when you have communist tyranny in China. But now, of course, people understand, or at least at some level they intuit, even if they don't want to admit, that this hasn't happened and is not going to happen, that we are not in fact liberalizing China or winning a great struggle against injustice by having deep economic relationships with the People's Republic of China. That in fact China has, as Joel Kotkin has rightly pointed out, become a new kind of competing model, partly capitalist and partly communist, and really it is managerialist in the way that James Burnham had talked about in the 1940s. This new communist model is something which is now starting to transform us, rather than we being the ones who are transforming China. So there's a sense of disappointment, I think, that has settled in among businessmen about their role in the world. They still have the ethics and the virtues that are characteristic of the businessman, but they feel detached from a great moral struggle that would fulfill more of their human desire to combat injustice. And wokeness, by providing such a struggle, is able to engage them and to actually make them sort of, if not true believers and zealots, at least it makes them feel good enough about themselves while they participate in this narrative that they have a hunger to keep going and keep doing so. If you think about it, so many of the businessmen who boycotted Georgia over Georgia's election, sort of law, changes in the past few months, I think they really did believe in what they were doing. And they believed it because, on the one hand, there is this, sort of narrative that has been created about the civil rights struggle. At the time, in the 1960s and the early 1970s, the civil rights struggle and its aftermath were high risk and high cost for businessmen to be engaged in. They were really something that involved great moral struggles and great, upheavals within society. Today, what's happening, however, is a kind of pantomime in which corporate America and businessmen pretend as if they are fighting a great struggle for civil rights, but really there's not the same sort of stakes and not the same sort of risks that had been in place back in the 1960s. And this kind of live action role playing, this kind of pantomime of a virtuous struggle, is something that, again, I think a lot of business people find is a way to fill some of the psychological needs that are not filled by an otherwise prosperous, peaceful, but perhaps rather boring and morally lowly society. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. We have a slight change in our program. I'm going to introduce the president of the Claremont Institute, Ryan Williams, and the publisher of the Claremont Review of Books up to the stage. Stay seated. We're going to go back to Q&A for the panelists in just a moment.
Thanks, Arthur. I have the pleasure of introducing Congressman Jim Banks. Unlike most of Washington, he takes his day job seriously, so he has to get running, so we wanted to give him a chance to address the room. So I'll be quick. He's old school as a congressman. As the left often likes to tell rather than show, Congressman Banks has put in the work. Before coming to Washington, he served in the Indiana Senate. He's a former county Republican chair, a former Rotary Club president, and a Naval Reserve officer. In short, he has long time and close political contact with that rare and too neglected commodity here in Washington, D.C., that is the real interests and common good of his constituents and their civic community. He's also, of course, the chair of the Republican Study Committee and is responsible for the most sensible document of recent memory to come out of that committee, let alone the GOP caucus, his cementing the GOP as the working class memo to Kevin McCarthy. We've been honored to publish Congressman Banks at the American Mind, and I'm very honored to welcome him here to the stage today.
Well, good morning. It is so great to be with all of you. Let me first thank the Claremont Institute and Arthur Milikh for hosting me today. It really is an honor. I can't overstate the importance of the Claremont Institute stepping up to host conversations like this one, the one that we're having today. So thank you for all of the important work that you do, for this panel, other speakers who are participating in this important event today. House Republicans can't win this fight without your help. Though Republicans in Congress have come a long way over the last year, in the past 2 months especially, there's been a sea change. More members of Congress, especially on the right, than ever have woken up to the dangers of woke corporations. That is the crucial first step. So I'd like to thank Delta and Coca-Cola for their naked and idiotic partisanship. I'd like to take a few minutes to discuss my first experience with woke capital, because for me it was very instructive. In 2019, I wrote a letter to CalPERS, which is California's public pension fund, the largest public pension fund at the state level in America. CalPERS' chief investment officer is or was a man named Yubin Meng. Meng, like most senior CalPERS employees, had a long history in the private sector. Meng worked at Lehman Brothers, Morgan Stanley, and Barclays. But unlike the rest of the CalPERS staff, Meng belonged to something called China's 1,000 Talents program. The FBI describes 1,000 Talents program as, quote, an unofficial espionage wing of the Chinese Communist Party. Meng also redirected billions of dollars in California retirees' savings to Chinese corporations after he was appointed as the CIO. I pointed all of this out in a letter that I wrote to Governor Newsom, and in that letter I called on Mr. Meng to resign. Now, I expected pushback and indignation from CalPERS, and I got a fair amount of it. But more surprising to me were their incessant attempts to label me a racist, even though over time my letter was validated and Meng ended up resigning in scandal. Oak Tree Capital's founder, Howard Marks, said I was, quote, impugning someone's character on the basis of their family's national origin, end quote. Some of you might have heard of Blackstone CEO Stephen Schwarzman, who also leapt to Meng's defense. It turns out Stephen was one of Donald Trump's biggest donors, and unsurprisingly, according to Josh Rogan's new and important book, Chaos Under Heaven, acted as a go-between between the Chinese government to get to the Trump administration. Niall Ferguson described my letter as, quote, an opportunity for people to have a go at Chinese-born U.S. citizen. Just last week, CalPERS' current CIO described my 2-year-old letter as, quote, a racist attack on an Asian American. Obviously, my letter had nothing to do with Meng's ethnicity, because obviously, not all Chinese Americans are enrolled in Communist Party espionage programs. Think about it. Numerous investors, many who had nothing to do with CalPERS, joined together to accuse me of racism, disingenuously and without any evidence. Why? Because investments in Chinese companies are profitable. Investors who weren't affiliated with CalPERS saw my letter as a threat, and they used the language of the left to try to silence me. This is how woke capital operates. It's capital and corporations coalescing around narratives that hurt America because they think it will boost their profits. In many cases, because they think that they can protect themselves from regulation by championing leftist social causes. Or in the case of CalPERS, because they see themselves as citizens of the world, and so they see their interest as decoupled from America's interest. This is the lesson that I learned from CalPERS, and that I hope all conservatives understand. Woke corporations behave the way that they do because it's helpful. So we fix their behavior when we make it not helpful. That's why we're focused on this at the Republican Study Committee. By calling out their rank hypocrisy in the media and by highlighting it through congressional letters. When the Navy's CNO, Admiral Gilday, put Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist on the Navy's reading list, I sent a letter to him demanding answers. I take it he was quite embarrassed by it. Right now, the Republican Study Committee is working to arrange an in-person meeting with the CEO of Delta so he can explain to us how exactly voter ID laws are racist. We're tackling woke corporations legislatively too. Last week, I joined Burgess Owens' bill to codify President Trump's executive order and ban critical race theory in federal agencies. I've introduced a bill based on Clarence Thomas's opinion to roll back big tech's expansive Section 230 protections. And yes, conservatives must be willing to explore antitrust legislation more than we ever have before. These companies must understand that wokeness is divisive, immoral, and harms America. And even if they don't care about America, if they keep pushing it, it will end up hurting them too. Thank you very much for having me here today. I believe this discussion is crucial. I'm glad to be a part of it, and I promise you that as chairman of Republican Study Committee, a group of 154 members, Republican members of Congress, we are dedicated to this conversation moving forward too. I'm happy to take any questions if we have time to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Bob Trento from Naples. I just wanted to add, for some reason, not some reason, I see the Republican Party as one of our biggest challenges. There's very little pushback or very little of an opposition party to wokeness and to the Democratic Party, which seems to be all bought into it. We've got the Freedom Caucus, that's great, and we've got probably 5 or 6 in the Senate. But on a national stage, there's nobody fighting for the people that have values like the people in this room. And I just wondered your comments on that.
Well, I don't disagree with you. It's been a long time coming, and for too long, Republicans, especially Republicans in leadership, have been silent on these discussions. And for me, it hits home when Eli Lilly, a big pharma company in my home state, came to the State House this year and testified and ultimately killed a very popular voter ID law at the state level that was moving through our State House. And to your point, whether it's Republican leaders in Washington or in the states around the country, it's time to fight back more than we've ever fought back before. As I said at the beginning of my speech, I believe we're on the right track. Republicans are recalibrating. Our leadership is getting this more than before, maybe not satisfactory to everyone, but it takes events like these, it takes leaders like you to call on, especially your Republican members of Congress. I understand not all of you would self-identify as a Republican, but it takes pressure from you on our Republican leaders to get there. And I consider myself to be one of those leaders in the Republican Party, representing the largest conservative caucus in the Congress, 154 members. So that being said, the fact that I'm here and I'm the chairman of the largest caucus in the entire Congress overall, I hope gives you a sliver of hope. And then moving forward, when we all leave this room, I hope you'll put more pressure on all of us to do more, and I believe that we will. We do not have a choice. Anybody else?
Yeah, I have a question for you as well as the panel. We've heard differing motivations behind the leaders of corporations. So I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Andrea Lucas. I'm one of the 3 Republican commissioners on the EEOC, which ironically, of all places, is the last bastion of conservatism in the administrative state right now, given that we have majority control for a few more years. And so my question is, to what degree do you think that corporate leaders are looking for cover from the government, whether it's from the EEOC or from the Republican Party in Congress, against either their woke employees or the pressures that they're getting generally in the culture? Because I'm hearing varying things, both from the panel and from stakeholders. Some are saying, well, they're scared, they're terrified of their employees. Some are saying, well, they're willing to acquiesce because it makes them feel good, and others are saying that they're desperate for the government to take action. Figuring that out, I think, will help us determine how best to pressure and fix this.
That's a smart question for a smart panel. And with that, I'm going to race back to Capitol Hill. Thank you. God bless you all.
I'd say that the fact that all of the incentives align in the same direction is what creates this almost insurmountable force. So there is a component which is sheer coercion, whether it's coming from government or whether it's coming from, again, some of the higher level business powers, which say, you have to have this kind of policy or else we're not going to invest in your company. But there's also, that moral element that I alluded to, where you want people not only to be, sort of forced, so to speak, at gunpoint to obey your commands. You want them to internalize as much control as possible. And this again goes to the 1984 and, to some extent the Brave New World examples. That, a really effective system of total control is not based just on coercion, it's also based on getting people to implicate themselves in the system. And so I think you have to attack it at both of those, in both of those ways. And it does seem to me that the resistance that, if you're able to create a counterforce within government, if you're able to create a counterforce within the culture, You have to do both of those things because otherwise, even if you knock down, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. You knock it down in one place, it's going to pop up in another because it has these bastions in the moral level, in the capital level, and in the government level. And finally, I'll just say that it seems to be one of the things that conservatives need to do, and one of the reasons why you see progressives so angry about the idea that the 2020 election was not fully above board. It was, that they're mad that conservatives think it was stolen, precisely because they realize that that is a narrative that involves injustice. And if conservatives are able to, embrace a narrative that involves injustice, they're going to be able to fight just as tenaciously as progressives do. Now, I have my own thoughts about the election, and they're not quite the same as most other conservatives, but it does seem to me that there is an example there of the ability to talk about something you perceive as an injustice in a way that really gives you a moral force and strength that you otherwise lack. And I think you can do the same thing when we talk about crime levels. I think, we can talk about the injustice that's being done to our police officers right now, and that if you're able to say that, we need to actually fight for the innocent people within our cities who are being gunned down by criminals every single weekend in this city and in cities across America, that kind of moral resistance against injustice will give us the power that the left right now has been able to wield by using this narrative derived from the struggles of the 60s.
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like all three categories you mentioned are true, right? I mean, we all know people in each of those three categories. And what I would say is, I think that the most difficult case is when you have really large corporations that are thoroughly globalized, and it's almost as if they're just being cannibalized. I mean, I know people on the inside, telling me about this, and you watch it from the outside, and it's sort of terrifying, where you have companies that are just in a great position, they're not going to go anywhere, and they're basically, slowly being eaten from within. I don't know what to do about that. I have no idea. That's above pay grade, but frankly, I don't think there's much that can be done. It seems to me that the most important thing is to provide cover and slipstreams for people, especially creating new businesses, but also within the current system, and really focusing on how to provide enough space so that they can start operating in ways where they're not going to get crushed. And that seems to me the tip of the spear.
Hi, thanks for putting this together. This is a really great panel. I just want to put a couple of tools out on your radar. I'm Justin Danhoff. I've actually been fighting the woke for 12 years as a shareholder activist from right of center. It's been a very lonely battle. I'm glad that there's more people willing to fight. And I would put it to you this way. The takeover that we're talking about of this cultural lane is three parts. It's top down. It's the C-suites and the boards that are starting to resemble, leftist positions. It's bottom up. It's the employees that we're talking about. They're all afraid of their employees. And this is everywhere. This is at Facebook, but all the way to Coca-Cola, right? And it's outside in. That's where we all live in, right? It's the outside in takeover. And I want to put two issues on your plate. And they're shareholder votes, right? If you think the 2020 election was rigged, they've got nothing on the way that shareholders engage with business. First of all, again, I'm the right of center shareholder. That's it. There's almost 100 groups on the left that engage as activist investors to push their issues. And the evidence shows that we have the equivalent of a red or purple state election that goes blue every year because they coalesce their money and vote, and we're not voting. So there's two sets of votes that nobody's paying attention to. Boards of directors are elected every single year at annual shareholder meetings. Are you mad at Coke? Vote their board out, right? You mad at Delta? Vote their board out. And so we're not doing that. Al Gore gets like 99% of the vote on Apple's board every single year, but 35% of the vote doesn't show up. So think about the power we could have if we were showing up to vote. And the second is shareholder resolutions, right? I wish the congressman was back here because I'd like to put the proxy advisory firms on Congress's radar, because last year, 53%, quote unquote, of the vote at a shareholder meeting of Chevron asked the company to align its policies with the Paris Climate Accord. Because the left has rigged the vote while we weren't paying attention. The left files 400, 500, 600 shareholder resolutions on their pet issues every single year. I file about 20. So there's an imbalance here of voting. We think about voting very much in the political arena, but these two things need to be on our radar if we're going to have any effect in this space. So I want to thank you guys for that. I just wanted to put that on your radar. Oh, one last thing. Thank you. There's no morality in these companies that are backing or, protesting Georgia's voting law. In the last 3 weeks, I've gotten the CEO of Bank of America, Pfizer, American Express, Citibank, and Goldman Sachs all to back off of their push on Georgia by showing up as a shareholder activist and presenting them with the truth. There was no morality behind it. It was just that Stacey Abrams was the only one in their ear. We weren't in their ear. So if we engage and show up, we can have a lot of influence. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one last question. In the back.
Hi, yes, Jim Copeland from Manhattan Institute, and I want to echo what Justin was saying in the sense that he's done a great job of sort of being out there on his own fighting this, but this is something I've followed for years, this sort of shareholder proposal activism, and it is very left dominated, largely because they're just agency costs in the institutional investing world as well, not just in corporations, and it's something we got to really think about how to address. I guess my question, though, goes a little deeper here. And I think David at the outset was sort of talking about how a lot of this has been employee-driven, not capital-driven. I do think capital is a problem. It's what I spend a lot of my time on. But there was an interesting sort of quick analysis recently by Columbia's Richard Hanani, and I don't know if any of you have read this, about sort of ordinal versus cardinal belief structures and intensity of preferences, basically showing through a lot of metrics. And I do think some of his data set was skewed by focusing so much on 2016, 2020 election cycles, because I do think Trump is a bit of an atypical character there. But even looking back cycles before that, you can see this sort of intensity of preference. So we're not surprised to see this at, say, the universities, where the overwhelming majority of donations flow to Democrats, but you actually see it across a number of businesses, a number of professions, and if that's the case, folks that agree with most of us in this room, may be able to win elections, but this is going to be an uphill battle fighting corporations. Is Richard's analysis here correct? If not, why? And if it is correct, what are the implications?
Well, so we liked his analysis so much, we published it at the American Mind this week. I would say if there's a critique, it would be this. So his argument is, look, the right just doesn't have the dedicated group of activists who really care, are willing to get out there and take action, whether we're talking about shareholder votes or whatever else. I would say, what if it's the case that, take an issue like immigration. That's one where I think we could find a counterexample and say, actually, people have been very upset throughout the country about what's happened in immigration for 20 years, but this story, and it's not a story, it's the reality, is the party did not represent them and refused to represent them, and in fact suppressed the energy on the right when it comes to this issue. And there's a number of issues like that. So Trump sort of reveals a little bit of the latent energy, right, or the potential for activism. And so I have a little hard time with his analysis when I think, well, what was going on at the Trump rallies? I mean, how many politicians get people to show up like that? So maybe it's the case that they've been suppressed on the right, but certainly this is true. We don't have the kind of media spotlight to shine on efforts like, say, what Justin was talking about, right? So that's something you have to show, in other words, to large quantities of people who are potential activists what they can do, and frankly, what they can do simply or easily, right? And so you see these efforts starting to rise. There's a lot of energy moving in the direction that we're talking about here. But I think the media infrastructure isn't there. The kind of communications infrastructure isn't there to highlight it. And you almost need a new kind of rhetoric. Why? Because everything on the right is either suppressed by kind of mainstream institutions, of course, but also from within by its own party. So to answer the question, we have to see what happens when efforts like Congressman Banks's memo, right, start to gain traction. And certainly with what I'm doing both with Claremont Institute and with New Founding, I mean, I talk to people every day now who are really trying to do new things along the lines you described. So I mean, if there's a silver lining of hope, it's that the experiment hasn't been fully tried.
I'll just add to Matt's point that, when the competing narratives are on the left, we have to fight the Klan, we have to fight Nazis, we have to go out there and engage business in this, tremendous moral struggle. And the narrative on the right is, hey, we want the Leave Us Alone coalition, as Grover Norquist calls it. Gee, you can't really be surprised that the intensity of engagement is so much stronger on the left than it is on the right. And thankfully, we have organizations like the Claremont Institute that are now starting to add a degree of moral clarity and moral intensity to the discourse on the right. But for too long, it has been complacent and it has been libertarian, and it has not engaged a sense of ongoing injustice that we have to actively fight against.
Well, with that, we conclude our first panel. Thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. We reconvene in 15 minutes.
Well, thank you all again for joining us. For the sake of our live stream and video afterwards, I'm Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and The American Mind, and it's my pleasure to introduce our second panel today, which we will talk a little bit more about what to do with our distinguished panelists here. First, let me introduce them. Andy Puzder, immediately to my left, is former CEO of CKE Restaurants, the parent company for Carl's Jr. and Hardee's. He was President Trump's nominee to be labor secretary. Sadly, he had to withdraw after the usual GOP Senate fecklessness. And we should note that a lot of people don't know this, but Andy had a long career as a litigator and was one of the leading, really path-breaking litigators in the pro-life movement. So if you don't know that story, it's worth checking out. After Andy, we have Mike Anthon, an old friend of Claremont. He's a lecturer and research fellow at Hillsdale's Washington, D.C. campus. He's a senior fellow of the Claremont Institute. He worked for the Trump administration on the National Security Council. And interestingly, for our topic here on this panel today, Mike was a denizen, never really a citizen, of corporate America for a time, including at Citigroup and BlackRock. The interesting anecdote that he told me years ago, which I always remembered, was, Mike was kind of the last, he's Gen X, he's kind of the last group at Citigroup that had a somewhat diverse educational background. The guys older than him, they could have come from the University of Georgia or Harvard. But the young kids under 35, when Mike was there 10 years ago, all came from Princeton, Harvard, Yale, or Stanford. So that, I think, has a lot to do with our current predicament. And then finally, we have Chris Rufo. Chris was a Lincoln Fellow of the Claremont Institute a few years back. Just an obscure documentarian, but now he's a famous critical race theory critic. I would say it's all due to our time with him for a week at the Lincoln Fellowship, but that's not true in the least. Chris worked at the Discovery Institute. He's had this wonderful ascent on social media, taking on this issue of critical race theory, and has become a kind of repository for leakers and whistleblowers against this practice, and he's now a senior fellow, well earned and well deserved at the Manhattan Institute, and a contributing editor at City Journal. So with that, we'll turn it over to Andy to start.
Thank you, Ryan, and I don't see Arthur, but Arthur, wherever you are, thank you as well. It's an honor to be here and speaking at a Claremont Institute event, particularly on a topic as important as we are now all coming to realize very quickly woke capitalism is. For me, this is one of those horrific experiences where you are on a panel and there are a bunch of people who speak before you, and they say about 2/3 of what you wrote down to say. So a lot of this is just going to be off the cuff. It'll be just between us, and it'll be a very personal conversation because my written remarks have become less pertinent than they were at 9 o'clock this morning. I'm going to start with something nobody's done yet, which is quote Ronald Reagan, because how could we have one of these conferences if we didn't quote Ronald Reagan? And from a speech at Hillsdale College back in 1977. It was called What Happened to Free Enterprise? And if you haven't read the speech, read the speech. It's incredible. You could take that speech, 43 years old, you could change maybe a dozen words and give it today, and it would be just as impactful today as it was back in 1977. But one of the things he asked, have great corporations, have they abdicated their responsibility to preserve the freedom of the marketplace out of a fear of retaliation or reluctance to rock the boat? He says, if they have, they're feeding the crocodile, hoping he'll eat them last. And I think that's much of what we see out there with America's CEOs today. And there are a bunch of different reasons. I think really to understand how a CEO would look at this, and when I was CEO of CKE Restaurants, as Ryan said, we had about 4,000 restaurants in 45 states and 40 foreign countries. We did about $4 billion as a system the last year I was there. We were a New York Stock Exchange company and from 2000 when I took over until 2010, and then we were owned by a private equity firm. So I've got some experience in what, at least back in the 2000s, would motivate a CEO to take a position on an issue one way or another. And I can tell you, there really, to understand how CEOs would look at what's going on, you really need to go back to why we have corporations in the first place. And we have corporations because obviously they provide a liability shield, which allows people to invest, and their total risk is what they invest. They're not investing everything they ever owned or everything they might own like a business owner. They're investing, their risk is just what they invest. And that encourages people to invest, because if we don't have that kind of protection, we generally tend to put our money under a mattress, and money being a depreciating asset, that's not where you want it to go. You want to invest with somebody who will protect your investment and maximize the returns on that investment so that your money becomes worth more. Now that's all pretty simple, and I know you all knew that. But this stakeholder capitalism, ESG investing, woke capitalism, this strikes at the heart of our capitalist system. It does so by imposing non-economic obligations on American businesses. It reduces the focus on profit, and in doing so, reduces the incentive to invest, and therefore the capital available for growth. So over time, this will have an extremely negative impact, and it has the most negative impact for working and middle-class families, because it means fewer jobs and lower paying jobs. So why would we walk away from the system? You know, it's been incredibly successful, right? Inspiring people to make a profit has lifted billions of people out of poverty in capitalist countries and modern economies. I mean, the environments are better, the healthcare systems are better, the education systems are better, the standard of living is better, GDP per capita is far superior. Why would we walk away from that? Well, there's really not a good reason to walk away from it, and it's a little spooky that we're even considering walking away from it. And I think it's a result of people, I'll call them collectivists. It's a certain mentality. But you know, we would, in Reagan's day, we'd have called them communists, but they keep changing their name. They're communists, progressives, I don't know, whatever you want to call them. It's kind of ridiculous. Now they're called Democrats. I mean, you know, it's whatever you want to call them. But back in those days, you know, communism, the major tenet was the proletariat versus the bourgeoisie, and this is how you generated support. Was you know, the workers of the world, the bourgeoisie was to unite. It was the benevolent socialist versus the greedy capitalist. Well, they've kind of taken that, which didn't work in the economy. I mean, we all know that just didn't work. It's an abject failure every place it's been tried. And they're trying to move that sort of to the social sphere, so that you now have the woke and the unwoke, the right and the wrong. If you're not woke, you're wrong. And it's really just taking that same sort of tenet that they thought would move forward in the economic system and moving it into the social system. And as it penetrates corporations, there are different things that motivate CEOs. You know, normally you would think, well, as a CEO, you're motivated initially, you want investment in your company, so you want a profitable company, you want to convince people it's profitable, so they'll invest with you, and you'll have the capital to grow. After you get your capital, and let's say you're a publicly traded company, at that point in time, you want the stock to go up, you want people to invest, because when the stock goes up, your worth goes up. CEOs generally own a good portion of the company, or they have options or some other incentive that drives them to try and increase the value of those shares. Now there's two ways that that's being attacked. The first is, and a lot of the earlier speakers discussed how the left gets together and will boycott or threaten CEOs so that their business, they want to step back and say, you know, God, leave us alone, or at least appear like they're doing whatever they're being asked to do by these woke leftist boycotters. or people that are protesting, or you want to stay out of their sight. You want them not to be picking on you. And I tell you, that kind of bothers me less than the second threat, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute, because I do think we actually counter that threat. I do think we step up, and increasingly so recently. You know, if you adopt these leftist policies, that is a threat to your business. And I'll give you a few very public examples. Let's take the Oscars. 23.6 million viewers a couple years ago, under 10 million this year. I mean, God, can you even watch a movie anymore without, or a TV show without getting depressed? I mean, without having your values insulted? I mean, nobody wants to watch these shows. I went to the Oscars, I mean, I don't know, maybe it was 5-10 years ago. It must have been at least over 5 because I retired 5 years ago. And they brought Michelle Obama in to speak. Of course, they never asked Melania Trump to come in and speak, and to my knowledge, they never asked Laura Bush to come in and speak. But Michelle Obama, I didn't want to be at the Oscars hearing Michelle Obama speak. I wouldn't want to be anywhere hearing her speak, quite honestly. But the politics of this, and then we're going to hear from J.D. Vance today, a hillbilly elegy. Look, in a saner time, in the time of Chariots of Fire or A Man for All Seasons or Ben-Hur, that movie would have been in there for the Oscars. But it doesn't relate to any of us anymore, so we stop, even all the great-looking celebrities on the red carpet, we just stopped watching. The NFL, I mean, their viewership is down to levels that they haven't seen, by some estimates, going back to 1969 when Joe Namath was in the Super Bowl. As a matter of fact, they were down, their ratings were down the lowest since 2006, and some metrics the lowest since 1969. The NBA, their ratings are down 45% from the 2011 and 12 season on ABC and 40% on TNT. But it's not just these very public entities, that really aren't shareholder-type companies. There's also shareholder companies. Look at Disney. Disney fires that wonderful actress that was in the Mandalorian. I can't remember her name. But they fired her. They went woke on diversity training. And strangely enough, about a week and a half ago, it was announced that Disney didn't meet what the analysts said its new subscriber goals would be, and their stock went down. Well, look, I canceled my subscription as soon as they fired that actress from The Mandalorian, whose name I can't even remember. But I called and canceled the subscription. I don't know how many people canceled, but obviously not as many people were signing up because they've insulted part of their base of potential purchasers. Coke is probably the best example. Now, Coke, they went very woke on this diversity training. I don't know if you remember, a lot of people, we were Coke's 6th largest, what do they call it? We bought the syrup from them. We were their 6th largest purchaser, I think, in the world at one point in time. And a lot of the people I know at Coke called and were very upset about this diversity training. And then they went out and got woke on the Georgia voting law. Well, as of April 21st, Rasmussen came out with a poll that said 37% of the American public would buy fewer Coke products because of the positions that Coke had been taking. Well, I got to tell you, as a CEO, the last thing you want to see is a poll that says 37% of the public is less inclined to buy your products. And in fact, on May 4th, about 2 weeks later, the chief legal counsel for Coca-Cola, who had implemented these diversity training programs, and probably had a lot to do with what happened on the Georgia law, mysteriously resigned. And Coke also announced that it was backing off on this aggressive diversity program. So we can have an influence on these companies. We can have an influence as consumers. We can't have an influence as conservatives if we just kind of back off. This is why companies don't. Generally, in my day, you didn't want to take an aggressive position, unless you're like Starbucks or Patagonia, where you take an aggressive position because your customers are people that like that position, or the NFL, which you would think would make you take a more patriotic beer drinking type position, because that's the people that generally watch NFL games. But apparently, the NFL was unaware of that and walked away from the majority of its of people who watch those games. So what's the bigger threat? The bigger threat to me is the asset management firms such as BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street that create demand for your stock if you're a CEO. The reason you want to be profitable is because you want demand for your stock, right? You want people to want your stock because when there's demand, the stock goes up. If there's no demand, the stock goes down. And so when you can drive the price of your stock up by being profitable and being focused on being profitable, as Milton Friedman, preached, companies' primary responsibility is to their shareholders to generate returns consistent with law and ethical custom, which of course means you shouldn't do things that are illegal and it's okay to contribute to charities. But your primary focus should be on profitability for the company. And of course that involves these other stakeholder elements. There is no company in the country, I'm going to tell you right now in case any of you have never been in business or been living under a rock, there is no company in the country that doesn't pay attention to its employees. You don't pay attention to making your employees happy, you go out of business because your employees go to your competitor. There's no company in the country that doesn't pay attention to the people in its supply chain. Because if you don't pay attention to people in the supply chain, they're going to supply your competitors and they're not going to give you preferential treatment. And there's no company in the country that doesn't make at least some charitable contributions to the community. Last year there was $21 billion contributed by American corporations taking advantage of the charitable tax deduction because it's good to help the community. And it does, in fact, help your reputation as a company and is in the interest of your shareholders. So when you can drive the price of your stock by focusing on profitability, and if we can, as conservatives, or you don't have to be conservative, you could be a libertarian, just somebody who doesn't want companies focused on these woke issues. If we reject companies that become very woke, that's going to have an effect on them. Now, it might not have an effect on Nike because they're appealing, like Patagonia or let's say Starbucks, to a more leftist type clientele. They're into these younger people that are still buying their products. So you're going to have companies that do that, but you're not going to have the vast majority of companies doing that. So what's the big problem? Well, the problem is, let's take BlackRock, and I hate to pick on Larry Fink, but maybe I will anyway. BlackRock votes is either the first, second, or third largest shareholder in 80% of the companies in the S&P 500. Wow. And that doesn't include Vanguard and State Street. And it doesn't include the other 50 top asset managers that control $60 trillion in assets. And when BlackRock or one of these other asset managers goes to vote the shares on particular shareholder proposals, Justin's out there fighting this battle by himself. Talk about David and Goliath. I mean, this is a horrific situation. When they're out, so far this proxy season, according to the Wall Street Journal, BlackRock voted in favor of 91% of shareholder resolutions on the environment. But they're not voting their shares. They're voting shares they hold for all of us. I'll bet almost all of you have a mutual fund, and it's probably one of the BlackRock funds. It's probably in your investment portfolio. They vote for middle and working class Americans who have pension funds, 401ks, IRAs, who simply want a peaceful retirement, right? But they're voting their shares in favor of these woke ESG criteria, environmental, social, governance, investment criteria that these 50 large asset managers have adopted. And if they're not investing in the most profitable companies, they're in effect taxing their investors to accomplish their social goals because they're reducing returns. And nobody from a mutual fund ever called me and asked me if I was in favor of reducing my returns in favor of these, protecting the environment or having major diversity programs at the company. Nobody elected, Larry Fink and his ilk as politicians to try and enact these kinds of policies. Larry Fink actually said recently in a letter he sent out, I think it was to the companies that they invest in, where he talked about this environmental, the E part of ESG, and said it's going to require that to get to carbon neutrality by 2050, it would require that we fundamentally transform the economy. I didn't elect this guy to fundamentally transform the economy. I didn't vote for, did anybody else vote for him to fundamentally transform the economy of the United States? So when they're out there voting these shares, as this huge block, well, you may be able to try and hide from consumers and look neutral and not offend anybody. You can't hide from these guys. They're out there, Justin could tell you, they're out there voting in favor of these various proposals, and it's not in your interest as an investor. So let's talk for a minute about what kind of CEOs we have, because I think we've been talking this morning about CEOs generally, and as though everybody thinks the same. And there are different kinds of CEOs. I think, one, they're true believers. They're the ones that want the revolution. They probably run the tech companies. And there are some that run these asset management firms where they're using other people's money to accomplish their social objectives, like the heads of BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. But they're the true believers, and I don't think much we do is going to influence them. Then there are those who just want to be on the right side of history. They've been convinced that this wokeness is the right side of history. I wish some of them were a little older, because I could remember when I was a young lawyer prior to Ronald Reagan taking office. This is back in 1978. I became a lawyer. When people were telling us, Jimmy Brzezinski, I think was Carter's Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor. Thank you. Came out and said, X number of countries have converted from democracy to capitalism since the end of World War II, and no countries have converted from X number of countries have converted from democracy to communism since the end of World War II, and no countries have converted from communism or a dictatorship to democracy. And we just have to accept the fact that the future is communism, that communism is going to be present. We're just going to have to deal with it. Well, of course, 10 years later, we brought down the Berlin Wall, and things changed. So the way that intellectuals, the way that people view the history or getting on the right side of history isn't always how you get on the right side of history. Our capitalism has been relatively successful over the past 200-some years. Third, there are those whose shareholders' interests are served by woke capitalism. I used Patagonia and Starbucks as examples, and they're going to go out there and say things that appeal to their consumers. And then I think there's the majority of CEOs. They're the ones that are just bullied into doing this. They would prefer to be focused on running companies that are profitable. They'd prefer not to have to deal with these woke issues. It's tough enough to try and make a company profitable without worrying about whether Larry Fink's going to come down on you because you're not environmentally friendly. I mean, even Warren Buffett, who's a fairly powerful CEO over a company that owns a lot of other companies, was obviously nervous or upset about what BlackRock was doing with these environmental requirements, and stood up to him. Good for him. He stood up to him in the last shareholders meeting. So there are things you can do as a consumer. What then can we do about these asset managers? And really, they control so much. And part of it's, I think, that the fact that a lot of us really didn't awaken. I hate to use the word become woke, but a lot of us didn't awaken to the fact that this was happening until recently. And I think the Georgia voting law controversy was a big help in that respect. But it's been really over the last 5 months, 6 months, that I've become aware of this. I know when the Business Roundtable came out and said, well, we're going to focus on, I don't know, they listed 6 things, and shareholders were last. Our employees, our community, our supply chains, and I just thought it was bullshit. These guys are putting that out there because they want everybody to think that's what they're doing. But we all know that they're going to be trying to make their companies more profitable, and if this helps them, gives them a little cover so they can hide, then so be it. I really didn't have a great perspective on the power that was wielded by fund managers out in the stock market, and I'm not sure why I didn't, but I didn't. And I think we're at least starting to address that. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning, and it came out literally as I was walking out of my hotel room door to come down here this morning. An article came out called "Trump Allies Promote Portfolios Targeting Unwoke Investors." And it's about something called Second Vote Advisors, which is something I'm involved with. Kevin Hassett, the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors for President Trump, the individual who set up the S&P 500, the individual that ran the investment portfolio at the University of Chicago, and 2 or 3 other individuals with doctorates in economics have set up a fund that's called Second Vote Advisors. I'll tell you why it's called Second Vote in a minute. But so far there are two publicly traded ETFs. One is a Second Amendment Border Security Fund. The call signal is EGIS. And the other is a pro-life fund. It's LYFE. And these ETFs, for example, let's use the Second Amendment ETF as an example. If you invest in the Second Amendment ETF, there's no guarantee that you will have companies that advocate for Second Amendment rights. This isn't like a pure anti-ESG approach to investing. The only guarantee is that you won't have any companies in that group that oppose Second Amendment rights. You won't have activists in support of them, but you won't have any that oppose them. And in fact, about 90% of the companies in these ETFs are neutral. And once you come up with a universe of companies out of the S&P 1500 that don't support or that don't oppose Second Amendment rights, then there's an analysis applied that finds the most profitable companies. We want companies that focus on profits. Our investment theory is very simple. We think companies that focus on profit make more profit than companies that don't. And companies that don't being companies that focus on ESG type investing. And so far, and it's in the journal this morning, so far the results have been pretty good. From foundation back in November of last year through the end of first quarter, I think the life fund's up about 14%, the Second Amendment fund's up about 18%, and the S&P's up about 10.8%. So I mean, so far, the idea of investing in companies that are profitable has worked. We also have some indexes that we're going to be providing. Hopefully this will appeal to some red state pension funds. For example, if you're in Louisiana and you happen to be the treasurer and you're a big Second Amendment advocate, maybe you don't want to invest with banks or investment advisors that won't invest in gun manufacturers or munition companies or companies that actually oppose Second Amendment rights. So we're hoping to generate some support there. And the idea will be that once we get these funds up to where they've got assets under management sufficient to make a difference, and now we've got about 25 million, which, that's not a lot compared to the 60 trillion that these other people have. But it's up from just a couple of million just a few months ago. So it's really started to pick up. And we will then use the influence that we have in those funds to try and bring those companies into line. A lot of what Justin does, but hopefully with a little more influence than Justin currently has. And Justin's familiar with the people involved in this and has been working with them. So it's not like it's a completely different track. But we'd like to build up assets under management sufficient to make a difference so we can go in and encourage these companies to be neutral on some of these issues and to focus on what they should focus on, which is making a profit, producing returns for investors. There was and I don't know if Michael knows him or not, there was a guy named Tariq Fancy who implemented a lot of these ESG policies at BlackRock, and he had an article in USA Today, I don't know, it's a month or so ago, critical of certain companies because he calls it greenwashing, where they try and fake that they're environmentally friendly. And he admits it. They try and fake it because companies that are environmentally friendly just don't produce as good a return as companies that don't focus on being environmentally friendly. And then he also admits, of course, that the reason asset managers do that is because their primary responsibility to their investors is to produce a profit. So that, for example, these retirement funds have enough money to fund the retirements of the people that invested in them. So there are, again, the point here is if you're a CEO, you're going to be looking to your customers. You don't want to offend your customers. You want a customer base that will buy your products. If you're Coca-Cola, that's the whole world. If you're Starbucks, maybe it's a more limited group, or if you're Patagonia. But how do you satisfy these huge and super powerful investment firms that manage such an incredible amount of assets and may end up owning such an incredible amount of your stock, even small amounts of stock? Justin talked about he goes in with a few shares. When I ran CKE restaurants, we used to have PETA come in, and they would buy 5 shares of stock and come in and argue that we shouldn't use beef. Well, it was a hamburger company. I mean, so we at the time, we said thank you very much for your input and sort of told them to kiss off. But I think a lot of CEOs out there right now are in a position where they're forced to feed the crocodile, hoping he will eat them last. And I'm hoping we can do things, we can get things going in the investment community that offers CEOs the alternative to say, as Nancy Reagan said, just say no. Some of this stuff we're just not going to do. We're focused on our investors and on making a profit. And they told me to speak for 15 or 17 minutes. I, of course, have no idea whether I spoke for 15 or 17 minutes, because I think the congressman was supposed to be on this panel too, which meant we had a shorter period of time to speak. So I guess I'll turn it over to Christopher now. So, and thank you for listening to my unprepared talk.
All right. Great. Well, how is everyone this morning? Doing well? Good. All right. We had a lot of very erudite and esteemed panelists last time. I'm going to bring this down to a more practical level. And listening to the other panelists, I thought it might be helpful for me to just share what I've come up with now very quickly as 6 principles or techniques or tactics to fighting this culture war. And it's all based on my experience over the last year. Stumbled into it backwards initially and then have really enjoyed fighting it. But about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, I started reporting on diversity trainings in the federal government and looking at DEI trainings, critical race theory trainings at first actually one story in the city of Seattle that took off, and then I started getting sources reaching out to me from Treasury, Homeland Security, FBI, DHS, VA, EPA, the National Credit Union Association, or NCOA, whatever that is. And all of these stories of these divisive, abusive, ideological, and extreme brainwashing programs that they were subjecting federal bureaucrats to. And I started basically riding the dragon of these reports and putting them out on Twitter, appearing on Tucker or Laura Ingraham in the cable news. And then as these stories were starting to pick up steam, some really incredible things started happening. And I had a chance to do a joint monologue with Tucker Carlson at the beginning of the show. And I wrote out, the producer called me and says, hey, Tucker wants to do a joint monologue. Meet us at go to the studio in Seattle, write a script. So you have 3.5 minutes where you need to speak. So I furiously wrote a script, drive up to Seattle as fast as I could. And then they tell me, yeah, we couldn't get a teleprompter. So you're just going to have to just wing it for 3.5 minutes. And a little panic ensued. And then, the lights go out and I actually kind of just blacked out for about 3.5 minutes. I really don't remember what I said, but I remember finishing that monologue, and at the end I said, I call on President Trump, very dramatic, I call on the president to immediately abolish all of these critical race theory trainings from the federal government. And I had this feeling that something was about to happen. And the next morning I get a call from a 202 number, and I'm in Washington State, so that's like more of a rare occurrence for me. And I just it's 7 in the morning, calls my cell phone, and I said, all right, this is about to go down. And it's Mark Meadows, the chief of staff. And he says, Christopher, the president saw you last night. He instructed me to take immediate action. Let's get something done. And this, I think, has led to a huge moment in this fight on these ideological fights in this country. And it turned critical race theory from an obscure academic discipline and a series of Harvard Law Review articles from 1992 into a national fight that conservatives are winning. And I think over the course of this campaign, you have the President of the United States denouncing critical race theory by name at the National Archives. You've now had 14 state legislatures introduce bills to ban critical race theory trainings from their state agencies as well as K-12 education systems. And you have every conservative, governor and senator with presidential ambitions, now having gone on the record to denounce this ideology. And the polling data from the last 2 weeks has been really interesting. You've taken something that almost no one had heard of. Now you have probably about 200 million Americans are familiar with this, and 80% of Americans oppose the tenets of this ideology. And I think it's an example of leverage. It's like I'm one guy with a set of stories and a set of sources that figured out how to leverage this information and package it into a story and then connect with all of these people who are desperate for good information to act on. So everything from, obviously, the President of the United States, it's a large megaphone, but also to state legislators. And then also now what we're seeing is parent groups across the country going apoplectic at school board meetings to make sure that they're not teaching their kids to hate their classmates because of their racial identities and not trying to fundamentally change the historical understanding of the United States, not as a place that moves towards freedom and equality, but as an eternal repressive and oppressive institution that hasn't changed in the last 400 years. And I've learned 6 things, maybe subject to revision, but I'd like to share them with you because I think it could be really helpful. I think conservatives, maybe we have 2 internal problems that I've noticed. There's a tendency towards lamentation, I think that's kind of natural. And there's also a tendency towards abstraction, I think especially for people who are in a policy environment, an academic environment, an intellectual environment. And I think that we should try to move towards a tone of inspiration and a tendency towards action, to actually to bring it into the world of practical politics and then learning from there, so that feedback cycle that happens when you actually start fighting. So I'm just going to go through them, take them or leave them. I think it's important to fight ideologies, not people. A lot of the social media and cable news and general information that gets passed around on Facebook is fighting people. So there's all the bad people. There's Ocasio-Cortez. There's the Squad. There's Joe Biden. There's whoever the bad person of the day is. And there's so much energy that gets drawn into these personality fights. It's Candace Owens fighting on Twitter with Cardi B. And this gives a sense of conflict and emotional satisfaction, but I think it's at best unproductive and probably more likely counterproductive, because you've devolved the conversation into a tabloid fight, right? You become essentially a political tabloid fight of personalities, when I think we really need to start pinning the attack on the ideas that are causing destruction. I think it's both morally correct, but I think it also yields better practical results. And I think with this critical race theory fight is what we did successfully is we labeled it. People were understanding that something is going wrong in the culture, that certain ideologies and ideas were devouring institutions, and then we put a label to it, critical race theory. Actually, they put a label to it in the 1990s. We just appropriated it. And then we went and attacking it both theoretically, attacking its principles and making those arguments, but also attacking it at a very practical political level and providing political leaders with a cudgel with which to beat down these institutions. So I think that's number 1. 2, don't win the debate, win the fight. I've seen like the most nasty and vituperative fights are when you say something, and I try to stay out of these fights because I'm ignorant, but I'm sure Michael Anton would be very knowledgeable. But if you say, well, this all can be traced back to Hegel, you get the most insane fighting in this academic realm. And I've noticed people trying to bait me into a lot of these fights where they say, well, you don't even understand the true historical nature of critical race theory, or you must not have read, Mari Matsuda's definitive 1996 paper. And I just avoid these fights, and I block those people and I move on because, there's these like very kind of pathetic and very, angry graduate students that try to fight me on these highly technical, Hegel interpretations. And it's like, I don't have time for this. I don't give a shit about this stuff.
For the record, I'm not even on Twitter, so he can't possibly be talking about me.
I'm not talking about Anton. And we'll let Michael take on these fights on our behalf. God bless anyone who does it. But I think the important thing is to say for these folks, and people will email me, there are people that are, that are making these cases against you. And it says, all right, well, there are some academics that are ankle biting me on social media, while at the same time we have 14 state legislators banning this ideology in their entire states, representing, 120 million Americans? And, Ron DeSantis and Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz and everyone else who is fighting in the political arena, we are winning in these political fights. We can cede the academic fights to their irrelevant position. Third, tell stories to move people. I think this is the most important thing. It's one thing to make an intellectual case against critical race theory in this example. It's another thing to say, well, critical race theory is a kind of neo-Marxist framework that derives from critical theory that has now been attached to identity politics and a kind of Angela Davis-style racial radicalism. That's very interesting, but I think it's another thing to say they're teaching third graders in Cupertino, California to deconstruct their racial and sexual identities and then rank themselves as oppressor and oppressed. I think that's a much more effective 15-second soundbite that you can inspire action with. And that's what I've tried to do with a lot of these stories, is to say, they are showing videos, dramatization videos of dead black children to kindergartners, warning them that, quote, racist police could hunt them down and kill them at any moment. I think that is going to move the needle in a much more dramatic way, because like Daniel McCarthy said, it evokes a sense of injustice and brings it down to a tangible piece of information, a tangible narrative. And I think that ultimately that's what, when you get the apoplectic parents at school board meetings that are giving up their weekday evening to go and try to take this fight, they're not doing so because they have read your brilliant Quillette article, version number 8,000, but because they're sensing that this ideology is tangibly hurting their kids. And we need to make that story known. Fourth, don't point out hypocrisy, change power structures. There is a genre of conservative commentary where we think that if we point out hypocrisy for the next time that we're really going to own the libs. This is like, it's actually, it doesn't work, A, but B, I think it's actually even worse. The hypocrisy is not, the hypocrisy is really the point of all this, right? The hypocrisy doesn't reveal that these people are morally hypocritical. The hypocrisy reveals that they have a position in the real world of practical power that enables them to be shamelessly and openly hypocritical, and you can't do anything about it, right? The point is not to tag them with the label of hypocrite. This is politics. At a certain point, you could probably tag that label to a lot of people. The point is to change the political and the structures of power beneath them that enable them to be hypocritical. Does that make sense? Good. All right. Fifth, and this is like something that I take immense pleasure in, make bad actors pay a price. And I think this is what Andy was saying, where he actually cited two examples for fighting woke capital: Coca-Cola and Disney. And those are, I think they hit all of the previous 4 points. Those are telling stories. It's trying to win the fight. It's making a narrative out of this. And those stories were put out, the Disney one was me. I broke the story on the Disney diversity training. And it was actually really awesome because initially they put out this really pathetic statement saying, oh, this writer has distorted our diversity training program, which is extremely glorious. And we can't possibly be racist because we made the film Black Panther. And it's like, so Disney, the woke Disney is trotting out the I have black friends defense. And you realize the absolute pathetic and craven nature of these ideologies, that even the mega $330 billion Disney corporation that literally tells stories for a living is trotting out this absolute trash PR statement that shows that they knew they were on indefensible grounds. And I said very calmly, well, I actually annotated their statement with footnotes saying why it was all kind of bullshit. And then within 24 hours, some smart person at Disney just deleted their entire anti-racism program from their internal website. Gone. And of course, I gleefully, tweeted that out. And it's probably going to come back, right? But it shows that you can even leverage these huge corporations by making them pay a price. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. You can make them pay a price through PR, through media, through legislation, through policy, through shareholder activism. But figure out where the weak points are and leverage them as much as you possibly can. And I think that a lot of this stuff is figuring out how internal power works. And I've been trying to answer this question. Disney was my first story. I'm going to be now doing a series of stories on woke capital. The next in my crosshairs is a large defense contractor. We're going to see how that goes, I think probably Wednesday of next week. But we're going to start going after these people and trying to raise the price in a way that is meaningful and in a way that starts to change the decision-making incentives. Because what I think is happening internally through my reporting and preparation for this is that you've created a DEI bureaucracy that was referenced in the last session. And for many years, conservatives said, oh, look at all these fake majors, like, the grievance majors and the kind of social justice majors. Look at these fake college majors, and these kids are never going to get a job when they graduate, ha, ha, ha. What we've seen is that these fake college majors have turned into fake jobs to promoting fake ideologies. So formerly the unemployable gender studies major is now the microaggressions investigator at the University of Michigan, or the DEI compliance junior officer at the Coca-Cola Corporation, or the internal commissar at the Department of the Treasury under the Office of Women and Minority Inclusion that sends out daily propaganda emails to all Treasury employees until Trump stopped it, and now they're back. And so you have this internal political apparatus that we need to, I think, discredit, dismantle, and then replace. And I think we're in now the discrediting phase, which is, I think, a lot of fun, frankly, because it's like you have these interchangeable PowerPoint presentations that go around all the corporations, and they're so patently ridiculous. Just by posting them in full on Twitter, all of these things start to just explode and implode within these institutions. And then sixth and finally, I think we have to attack. It's one thing to try to understand these things perfectly intellectually or try to understand them perfectly as a policy matter, but sometimes you just have to throw the hand grenade into the enemy camp and see what happens. And I think we need to be throwing many more hand grenades into the institutions that are promoting this ideology and seeing what happens when they start to scramble and seeing what happens when they're under pressure. Because for the last 10 years, nobody has fought back against this stuff. Nobody. I can trace this through all of the thousands of documents that I've reviewed over the last year. You see the ideological growth, you see the institutional growth, you talk to the people that are now under the thumb of these programs that are silent dissenters, and you realize that it's been 10 years that these things have been metastasizing and nobody has fought back. In the last year, that's shifted dramatically. We've started fighting back, first at this kind of media level, but now we're starting to see people courageously stepping out from within institutions, teachers that are saying, I don't agree with teaching neo-racism to my students. You can fire me, but I'm no longer going to do this. You have dissenters within institutions that are now pushing back in a more subtle and within the institutional level. And then you're now seeing the kind of eternal laggards, the actual politicians, realizing that this is a tremendous opening on a set of issues that, frankly, conservatives have never been very good at tackling. And I think that it reveals an immense opportunity. And what I'm seeing on the ground is that the lacking ingredients are leadership and courage. There are people at the grassroots level that are absolutely fired up. People say, that at these town hall meetings or community meetings or school board meetings, this set of ideologies, kind of labeled as critical race theory, is the number one kind of motivator and energy driver for grassroots conservatives and even center-left liberals. And so this just needs to be channeled productively by good leadership. And I think that's incredibly important. And then the virtue that is required is courage, because it's scary for a lot of people. People are silent because they don't want to lose their job. They don't want to be labeled a white supremacist. They don't want to be chased out of their good standing, chased out of a position of good standing in their community. And at the corporate level, they just, they don't want to be, labeled the bad guy who is opposing the diversity initiative. But we need to fight from a position of principled courage. And I think what I've learned, and I'll be honest, I'm not immune to this. I'm a white guy fighting critical race theory. It's like, it got a little bit, there were moments where during this fight, as it was kind of blowing up nationally, it's like, oof, I am about to get blown up. I mean, some harrowing and kind of scary times, because it was certainly the first time that I was going through this, but something kind of strange happened. It's like I focused on the substance. I revealed the actual stories, the truth of what's happening in real life, and none of the counterattacks have ever laid a finger on me. Not the New York Times, not the Atlantic, not the critical race theorists, whose best argument now is, well, you don't even really understand what critical race theory really is. The great true communism has never been tried defense. But I think that we're fighting this issue from a position of such intellectual strength and practical strength that it is an absolute winner, and we should have the courage to fight. So I would encourage you all to get involved in any way that you can. Figure out what levers are within your control and how to pull them to fight this. And on the last optimistic note, I think corporations are the institution that is easiest to deliver change in. I released a series of 12 investigative reports on public kind of wokeness and in K-12 public schools. Well, guess what? K-12 school administrators are the least responsible, most bureaucratic, most heavily ideological, and least kind of nimble and capable, frankly, institution that we have. So I'll dump these absolutely horrific stories right on their head. They'll generate 25 million media impressions, and none of them changed because they're permanent bureaucracy, they're unaccountable, they just sit and do nothing. But corporations, I think if you hit them hard enough, they will change. The Coca-Cola story was released by a knitter and a human social organizational psychologist and knitter, like knitting, who has a loud Twitter account that she said, Chris, I got these great documents from Coca-Cola. I said, drop them. And this feisty knitter, threw the hand grenade inside the boardroom at Coca-Cola and changed the game. And I think that this is a point for optimism because ultimately, at least in my experience, I have some experience in kind of the adjacent to the tech world in Seattle and Silicon Valley. None of the people actually believe this stuff. They're Havel's greengrocer, right? They don't believe in any of this stuff. They feel like they have to do it. But if we can give them an exit, if we can embarrass them enough times, if we can raise the price of behaving in this way, if we can make it actually seem pathetic. This is a political ideology perpetuated by the HR department. What is more pathetic than that? It's like Toby from The Office going woke. It's just horrible. And frankly, we have to demonstrate that this is a loser ideology promoted by the most loser departments of these institutions, and we have to turn it culturally toxic. And once we can do that, you're going to see these corporations starting to shift, and we're going to give those executives an easy out. When you say, hey, Coca-Cola, actually telling people to, quote, be less white is kind of offensive to a lot of people and probably not a good program to hitch your wagon to. You're giving that CEO an easy exit. He now has cover to do the thing that he probably wanted to do anyways, but couldn't do it because of the social pressures. So let's get after it. Let's get after it. Let's have fun. Let's fight and let's win.
All right.
I was asked to speak about what to do. I don't know why I particularly was asked that question, what to do about this. I usually don't have any terrific ideas about what to do about anything. But I thought about it, and I came up with 7 options. And I'm going to list them in sort of ascending order of effectiveness if they could be pulled off. And I mean effectiveness in the sense of, would this work if we could do it, not how realistic is it that we can do it. So 1, infiltrate these companies. 2, apply shareholder pressure. 3, boycott them. 4, use state power against them. 5, build parallel institutions. 6, wait for the SALT to collapse. 7, accelerate the collapse. Okay? So let's go through them. I'll try to infiltrate them. All right. Meaning, like, I'm a college professor, so I have students come to me all the time and say, oh, you did X or you did Y in your career. I'd like to do that too. How do I get into that? And I'm honest with them. I tell them how I did it, but I also try to tell them, look, there are costs to this, and it could be a problem for you, and you need to think about it before you decide to pursue this particular career. This would be essentially an attempt by the right to do what the left, the so-called long march through the institutions. Are we capable of doing that, of recruiting all of these people and doing to these institutions what the left did to them over the last 50 years? I have my doubts as to whether we have the organizational capacity and so on and so forth. Before I would encourage any student of mine who says, I want to go to New York and join some big corporation, I'm honest with them and tell them what they're up against. And if you send them into one of these institutions, they're not going to be joining a big company in 2005 like I did for the first time. They're going to be joining it in 2021, and they're going to have a very different experience. And to be a dissident within that company is going to be hard for a lot of the reasons that Chris said. You can try to shake things up, in which case you're going to be putting your career at risk, or you can just sort of keep your head down and be quiet and do your job and make money, in which case you're not really performing a long march through the institutions, you're just burrowing in. And I don't know how effective ultimately that would be. Shareholder pressure. I know we had a speaker ask a question about this, and Andy talked about it too. This is effective, I agree it's effective, but again, what we can do seems to me to be pale in comparison to what the left does, in 2 senses. One, I remember the very first time I went to an annual meeting. I'd never been to one before, and it was in Manhattan in 2005, in my first job out of government, and the annual meeting, you should come and watch this. I thought, oh, sure. And it was News Corp, for what it's worth, the pre-division News Corp, which is now 2 companies. News Corp owns the newspapers, and 21st Century Fox owns the TV properties, but back then they were one company. And Rupert Murdoch was and is the chairman, and he just had to sit there and listen to people come up to the microphone and harangue him in really ungodly bad terms. And I was just shocked by this. I was like, I can't believe this is happening. And I went out to the lobby at one break, and I called my father, who's been a corporate lawyer for years. I can't believe what I'm seeing. So, well, I explained it to him, and he goes, that's what they do. I mean, they let off steam. This is just theater. You're like the young horse who hears a car backfire and freaks out, and you look around, all the other horses are still chewing grass. You need to hear it a couple of times, and you realize this is just sound and fury. Except that it isn't really. These activists can and do apply pressure that shareholders listen to because they want it more. They want it more than our side. And this is a problem conservatives have across the board is, there's always a little share of the population, for whatever, that cares deeply about some issue that will make noise and cause trouble and until they get their way. And our side tends to want to go about their business and do their jobs and live their lives. And we don't want it as much. And so we let them have their way. And the other problem on the shareholder pressure is, Andy talked about, my last job, I assume for the rest of my life in corporate America, was at BlackRock. of all things, which is, as Andy said, the number 1, 2, or 3 shareholder in most companies. It's a humongous firm and with enormous outsized power. When I left 5 years ago, was it 5? I guess it was 4. At BlackRock was $4.7 trillion under management, AUM. It's 9 today. In 4 years, it's almost doubled its AUM, right? Its power just keeps getting more and more immense. BlackRock famously, for the longest time, didn't used to vote its shares, right? And they turned on a dime at a certain, I don't know exactly when, but they turned on a dime and said, no, we're not only are we going to vote our shares, we're going to vote them only in the terms that have been described here. Like BlackRock never takes a stand for anything conservatives care about, ever. They often take stands for things conservatives oppose. I'm all for applying shareholder pressure wherever possible, but we have to keep in mind that the other side's ability to apply it, both through these institutional investors and through the activists who simply care more, is greater, I think, than ours. The third is boycott them. Azerrad said earlier, conservatives don't boycott. In general, I think he's right. I mean, it's first of all, because we don't care as much. The left cares more. So, if you want to, it's hard to boycott. You got to keep a list of all the things that you won't buy. I have friends of mine who, going back years, who say, I'm not going to buy anything made in China. First of all, try finding something that isn't made in China. Okay, but let's say you can. You can keep extensive lists. You're going to have to look at the packaging on every decision you make, and who's going to, some people who really, really care are going to go to that length, that effort. But very few, I think, are. It's hard. I don't see us mass mobilizing our side to do that. Now, there are these recent exceptions. I know a lot of people were ticked off at Coke. I remember. I read emails from people. I'm never drinking another one of their products again. And it's enough, I guess, to at least scare Coke or hurt them temporarily. I don't know how long that's going to keep up and that's going to last. But I would say, though, if we could do this, if we could actually organize this to say, you do this, we'll boycott, or it would work. It would definitely work. And maybe Azerrad's point, conservatives don't boycott, maybe that's true up until the point that it isn't. Maybe people will start to get fed up enough that they'll say, look, I grew up in California. I've been going to Disneyland since I was a little kid. I took my daughter there, 5, 6 years ago, and my son's never been, and at this point, I don't think I would ever go. I just, first of all, I don't know that he cares that much. If you kind of grow up on the product, maybe you do. But that's a personal decision that I made. Is that going to be enough to mobilize conservatives more broadly? I think it could be if we put some more energy into this. The fourth, use state power against these companies. Now, this is a particular problem for conservatives because of their ideology. They will say, and they often do say, these are private companies, they can do what they want, sort of. We can't interfere in the judgment of the market, and so on and so forth. Well, it was a Republican, albeit a progressive Republican, that the Claremont Institute has mixed feelings about, I will say, named Teddy Roosevelt, who used state power to bust trusts that had accumulated too much authority over the economy and society at the turn of the prior century. Republicans have been completely allergic to using state power in this way, even against companies and industries that are absolutely there. Sorry, I can't think of a better term for it, not one that is in any event more accurate. They're enemies, right? They won't do things that are in the public interest against companies that are their personal and political enemies and that act against the public interest because of this ideology. So overcoming that ideology is going to be hard, but I think that's something that, to borrow from Chris here, we can win the debate on that. I don't know if we can win the fight. I mean, because I think the arguments that the so-called conservatives have on this is actually quite stupid. The debate is fairly easy to win. Getting actual people elected who are willing to use state power is harder. I've heard, we hear promising noises sometimes from the Senate, from Hawley, from some others. Most of what they propose actually looks like fairly weak tea. Now that could be just the beginning, and the further along we get into this process, the worse it gets, the more they're going to propose very serious things. But usually when you get a bunch of conservatives together and say, well, we're going to go after big tech, or we're going to do X, or we're going to do Y, and you look at the actual text of the bill, it's quite weak. The fifth was build parallel institutions. Now this is, of course, borrowing from the which has become now just a joke phrase, well, build your own Google, build your own bank, build your own country or society, and so on. It's become, the libertarians, it's been used to say that, I think, they still say it in earnest, but now one hears it more as a taunt back at them, at the stupidity and shallowness of their arguments. That sounds very hard to do, and it would be very hard to do. On the other hand, as a believer that often good things arise from necessity, I think if and as capital and these big companies become more and more woke, this is going to become a necessity. Well, the more people get unbanked, somebody's going to come along and say, I'm going to build a bank that's going to allow you to put your money in, and I'm not going to go scour your Twitter to see if you've said a bad word before, and so on. I think this could happen. Now, then what will happen, of course, is the regime, which is a combination of the government and these woke capital institutions, will find a way to lock these parallel institutions out of the systems to make them unviable, which means that they're going to have to turn the screws of their tyranny to a much greater degree than they've done so far. We'll see if they're willing to do that, and we'll see how effective they can be at that. But conservatives are going to have to be willing to build these parallel institutions if we're going to solve this problem eventually. And I think necessity, will spur that. That is to say, we all recognize right now it would be useful if we had banks that didn't exclude people over this and so on. If we had search engines that didn't tweak the algorithms to suppress certain information and promote other information. If we had all of these, but we're not going to really start taking them seriously or building them until we feel the real pinch of necessity. And unfortunately, I think at this point, we don't feel it keenly enough. But I think the day is coming probably when we will or when we might. Sixth is wait for this all to collapse and go away. I am a believer that it will have to. That is to say, this one I maybe can talk about a little bit longer because having worked in a lot of these companies and then been for a number of years a consultant to many more, I know them pretty well from the inside, got to understand the mindset. They're willing to sacrifice a certain amount of profit and a certain amount of competence for a certain amount of time to virtue signal. So they kind of go through their argument in stages. One is, this doesn't cost us anything. Doing all this stuff actually makes us money. We do better when we adopt woke policies, when we hire on a basis other than, strictly merit or the best person for the job and so on. And they come up with all of these rationalizations, arguments for it. Layer two is sort of, well, we might lose a little bit at the margins, but it's more than compensated for by all the things that we gain. Level three is, I'm willing to pay a price for doing the right thing. I mean, we heard a couple of quotes along those lines. I think Peterson quoted, Phil Knight saying that. And, woke CEOs are not new. I would say, though, for one thing, Phil Knight, just as not that I've ever done any work for them, but he's a little bit of an outlier in that, he's a real 60s guy who went in with the idea of making this company as kind of flower childy as he could, sort of like Howard Schultz at Starbucks. So I don't know that he's quite as representative. He's more vanguard. But they all eventually get to the point where, well, I'm willing to pay a price for doing the right thing. But Andy is certainly right that the purpose of these companies is profit. And we will test the economic laws of gravity if they can continue paying these prices forever and not see profitability go down, efficiency go down, eventually the stock price go down, and eventually these places just stop functioning the way they're supposed to, and the shareholders bail. We're certainly not at that point right now. I just checked on my phone to see what, when I left BLK, the stock was in the 400s. It got under the Trump rally in the first year of the Trump administration, it got all the way to about 590, and then it went back down, and it was in the 3 to 400s again. Well, it's been doing great lately. It's at 850 right now. So these places they're not suffering yet from any of these decisions, but if economics works the way, the old textbooks, the ones that told the truth about supply and demand and things like that, works the way we think it does, they'll eventually pay a price for this, and the system will break. You can't keep making decisions that don't have to do with your core, that either have nothing to do with your core business or that are antithetical to the interests of your core business, and keep expecting profitability to go up and the stock price to go up forever. But, okay, segue to number 7, which is wait for the collapse. So 6 was wait for the collapse. 7 was accelerate it. Well, why wait? Why not see if we can turn the screws on them a little and speed this process up? say, wait a minute, you said your board has to be only 5%, hires based on criteria other than, well, why not make it 100%? Why shouldn't the conservatives kind of start just concern trolling the heck out of woke capital and saying, you are not living up to your stated principles. If you are living up to your stated principles, here's the list of things you would be doing, and we put our own pressure on them and say, you got to adopt all of these policies in order to have a clear conscience and to be standing up for what is right. And of course, most, if not all of these policies would lead to their imminent collapse. Are they going to listen to us on something like that? Maybe, maybe not. I think, though, that I don't know if it'd be more effective, but it might be somewhat effective. As Chris says, calling out hypocrisy never works. A, they don't care. B, hypocrisy is priced in. And C, hypocrisy actually becomes part of a point of pride at a certain point in the way these companies operate. But telling them, if you say you stand for X, but you're doing Y and Z, that's wrong. You need to go all the way. That does have something of an effect on them. Now, all of that, I think, as I said, an ascending order of effectiveness in the sense of would it work or could we pull it off? Not in the sense of could we pull it off. In that latter sense, I do think things are going to have to get significantly worse before they get better. And I don't know how many, several of you were here at a conference, not here, but we did it in Vegas, but at a Claremont Institute conference that we did earlier in January, about big tech. So it was kind of a subset of this problem. One industry in woke capital, but a very powerful one. And Curtis Yarvin was there, and he said something that stuck with me, and I thought was memorable and wise. He says, well, what do we do about Twitter and Google in particular? And he said, well, people were proposing various ways to pressure them. So think about it this way: if you're Jack Dorsey, who are the priests that you care about the most? The people whose opinions matter to you most. It's basically Harvard and the New York Times. He really cares what's said about him in the New York Times. He cares what the Harvard faculty and the lead intellectuals think. He doesn't necessarily care what conservative activists think. Is it possible for us as a group to put more pressure on Jack Dorsey than Harvard and the New York Times puts on Jack Dorsey? So he's pressed from both directions, right? But on the one hand, it's a boulder that will run him over and squash him like a bug. And on the other hand, it's a 98-pound guy kind of going like this. So he's pressed. As a college professor, I remember this very vividly, it was in an astronomy class, I was talking about gravity. And it's all bodies, gravity is a mutual attraction between all bodies. And so somebody asked him the question, it's a huge lecture hall, somebody asked him the question, well, what does that mean? I know that if I jump off Sather Tower, which is a tower in the middle of the Berkeley campus, I will fall. Does that mean the Earth is? He said, oh yes, absolutely. If you jump off the Campanile right now, the Earth will rise to meet you, but it will be by like a micron or so. And most of it will be you going to meet the Earth, and you will of course be killed since the thing is 300 feet tall. It's the same sort of pressure that's on Jack Dorsey. We can apply some pressure, but we can't come even close to the amount of pressure that the parallel institutions apply. And that's, to me, the fundamental problem. Until and unless people feel either probably some combination of outrage, exhaustion, and necessity that they can't tolerate this anymore. And then they'll really start putting the pressure on these companies. Until then, knowing these places from the inside, I don't expect them to change. Right now, they don't fear us much at all. I think Chris probably thinks that they do because he's put a ton of pressure on them. I mean, he's maybe the counterexample to what I'm saying is he's put a ton of pressure on them and gotten them to. But to me, it's still kind of in the early game. But that's what we would need to do to actually fix these problems or address these problems in any event. I think that was 15.
This is a smart, sophisticated audience. You've all noticed we're well over time, so let's just ask a couple questions quickly, and then we can make sure we eat lunch before 3. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. My name's Jonathan Barry. I'm just a lawyer here in DC. Wanted to ask along those lines, it seems like part of the issue here, part of the obstacle to achieving many of the sort of the numbered lists that our speakers spoke to was a lack of willingness to leverage the law against private companies. So with a lot of ESG investing, for example, is in fact tightly circumscribed by ERISA, to give that as an example. And critical race theory inflected trainings typically constitute a hostile work environment under Title VII. Our firm, our founding partners, sent a letter to Coca-Cola on its violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. That got a lot of attention. What can be done to reconfigure the sort of the ecosystem of the conservative movement in terms of this little movement's institutions and structures to increase that willingness to use the law, which is often a real ally?
Yeah, I might take that. Yeah, so it's a great question, and I'll tell you what, you know, when the election results were tallied, and it was clear that Joe Biden would come into office on this critical race theory issue that I was working on, I knew that everyone knew, okay, when Biden gets in, he's going to scrap this executive order. So, you know, what I did was I went around to the various institutional players in the conservative world, to Heritage, to Pacific Legal, to, you know, all of the various players, and I said, all right, you guys should really start suing these people now. That's the next move. Can I feed you potential clients? Can I feed you stories? Can I help you promote this? And the unanimous response at that time was, we don't really do this. You know, this is not really in our issue area. This is not something we've done before. Some people said, well, we don't sue private companies. And there was a very kind of dead response. It's like, we haven't done any of this stuff before. And so I was kind of disappointed, and then I thought, well, I mean, I'll just do it. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm sure there are people that want to do this. So I put out a call and had, I think, about 150 volunteer attorneys all over the country say, we'll file suit. So we were working with this ragtag network. I think our first lawsuit was like a personal injury attorney in Los Angeles. And I mean, really people that were just, hey, I am a lawyer, feed me a case, or I have a lead on a case, like, let's just start filing lawsuits. But then something shifted within a few months. Once those initial kind of ragtag, solo practitioner lawsuits started getting filed, all of the institutions started to say, we want in on this. And now we have all of those big players that at the beginning were saying, hey, we're not really equipped for this. They're now in this coalition. And I think over the summer what you're going to find is, I'm not going to reveal too many details, but you'll probably see somewhere between 6 and 8 lawsuits getting filed on these issues in the next few months. And these are getting, you know, all of the big institutional players. I don't need to name them for you. They're all now working together in this coalition. And I think we have now the conservative legal movement seeing an opportunity to restrain and constrain these institutions through lawsuits. So it's happening.
May, though, the initial response you got is very telling. I mean, there's no chance that if the left wants something, there's people out there who will fund it, they'll get talent behind it, they'll build an institution, and they will press that issue to the wall until they get it. And we can't get any of our institutional assets, so-called, to do this. That we can't is very telling, and it just shows there's a failure on the right. Where is the money for this stuff? Where are the institutions that are dedicated solely to doing this, funded by, and you know, it's a problem that we have vis-a-vis, relative to them that's been deepening over the course of my lifetime. I hope that's beginning to turn around now, but I'm trying to be diplomatic here, but I don't yet, of course I exempt the Claremont Institute, but I don't yet sense this as much of a thing from the institutional right, or it needs to be.
Yep. This will be our last question, just so we can get set for lunch.
Good afternoon, Stephen Jordan. I've been on the front lines of this since it was known as corporate social responsibility and a lot of these things. And the problem is, this isn't something that just happened this year or last year. This has got about 30 or 40 years since 1980 of architecture, whether it's codes of conduct, whether it's creating the UN Global Compact, whether it's creating all kinds of curricula, basically going back to Boston College in 1986, Business for Social Responsibility in 82. I mean, This isn't something where we're going to have to be able to snap a finger and think that we're going to fight it all at once. But Christopher, you've been extraordinarily effective in this very short time on the leading edge of this. My takeaway from what you all have been talking about is that we kind of need an all of the above strategy. To Michael's idea, you hit them with the boycott, but you hit them at the holding them to account on their own petard. Nice Saul Alinsky thing going on there. But the truth is, again, as Michael was talking about, and I know this fairly well, it's really our millionaires against their billionaires. We're talking about kind of the base of funding for republicanism, small r republicanism, just doesn't have the capacity that 7 out of 10 billionaires, Bloomberg and Steyer alone put in $1.5 billion into the 2020 campaigns. We just don't have that kind of firepower. So it strikes me that strategically we need to think of like a short-term game, a mid-term game, and a long-term game. And we also have to think in terms of limited resources. So my question to each of the panelists is, okay, whether it's we have $5 million or $50 million, that really doesn't compare to 9 trillion, right? But say we had 5 million, because we have millionaires instead of billionaires. Say we had 5 million. Where would you spend it on? Do you focus on the immediate thing, or do we have to play more in the long-term thing? Where's the center of gravity if you don't have unlimited resources, where you start to hit, where you focus it?
Why do I have to answer that? Well, it comes back to this question of pressure, or really, if we want to be blunt about it, fear. You know, how can you? If these companies once they start to fear that, you know, instead of I'm sacrificing, you know, let's say 5% of my profits for doing the right thing, but 15 or 25, and I can't sustain that. That's when things change. So, what would engender the most fear? It seems to me that a sort of a combination of bad publicity and boycotts. The bad publicity fuels the boycott. So generate as much bad publicity as you can. I mean, expose as much stuff as you can. And let's see if we can't change that dynamic that David correctly pointed out earlier, that, you know, conservatives just don't boycott. Say, look, you need to. Like this was called the Center for the American Way of Life. The American way of life depends on you actually taking a political stand on what you buy and how you spend your money, because these companies are against your way of life. We have not even begun to try to motivate our side around that yet, and we need to if we're going to have any success at this.
You know, a lot of people talk about how it's very difficult to influence these companies with a small amount of money or a small amount of spending, or an unofficial boycott as opposed to what the left does with their official boycotts. But I have to tell you, if you're the CEO of a company, or you're running, let's say, the North American division for Coke, your sales are down 2 to 3%, you're worried. Your sales are down 5 to 10%, you're wondering what your next job's going to be. I mean, we can have an impact on these companies and the direction they take with a whole lot less than what the left is using. And I think that's really what happened with Coke recently. Was as I said, was that poll came out saying 37% of consumers would buy less Coke. Hell, I'm buying Diet Dr. Pepper, and for those of you who haven't tried it, it's a hell of a lot better than Diet Coke. I mean, it actually tastes like Dr. Pepper. But I mean, I'm buying less, and I don't know that it's having a big effect, but I think if enough of us are taking those, it's almost like the invisible hand in reverse. You know, the invisible, well, no, maybe it is the invisible hand of Adam Smith working to actually change the conduct of these companies. It doesn't have to be massive.
No, and Chris has shown that with some engagement of people's righteous indignation and some appeal to their sense of injustice, you can do a lot with a little if you really focus on media and strategic communications too. So that would be an adjunct, I think, where a little money would go a long way. And it's a place where the left plays very well and very effectively. And it doesn't always take $1 billion. It can take, you know, 5 million can be pretty effective. Well, good. Join me in thanking the panel. Thank you, everybody. Again, for the benefit of our video feed and the live streamers, if anyone doesn't know this already, out across the country. I'm Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review books and The American Mind. It's my pleasure today to introduce our final speaker to give our keynote lunch address, J.D. Vance. J.D. is, of course, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, the 2016 book that swept the country and in many ways was an interesting precursor to the rise of Trump. It was a memoir and reflection of J.D.'s rise from Greater Appalachia in southern Ohio to the Marine Corps, to the Ohio State University, and then finally to Yale Law School. J.D.'s book, of course, last year was made into a major feature film by Ron Howard, and I hear it's excellent, though I haven't seen it. It debuted on Netflix. J.D. didn't stay in the Northeast. He went out to Silicon Valley for a time, San Francisco. He wasn't content to practice law and disappear into that machine. He founded a nonprofit focused on the Rust Belt, Our Ohio Renewal, and he's the co-founder of Naria Capital, a venture capital firm based, surprisingly for these ventures, in Cincinnati, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. J.D., I'm told, or I read, has formed an exploratory committee to investigate a Senate run in Ohio. One of the more thoughtful and spirited commentators on what currently ails America, what we ought to do about it, how the right ought to orient itself. The future of the right is very at the top of the mind of everyone at the Claremont Institute and the Center for the American Way of Life. So we're lucky to have J.D. weighing in on these issues nationally, and we wish him all the success, and we're very honored to have him speak to us today. So, J.D.
Well, good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Here we go. Arthur, Ryan, how much time do I have? I want to make sure I'm not keeping anybody too long. 3 hours? Okay, great. So, you know, I thought I'd start today by sketching out a vision for how I see what we should be about in the conservative movement in the 21st century, because I think it's useful to anchor ourselves not just in first principles, but in the lives of the people affected by those principles. And then I'll talk about why woke capital I think is such a problem and what's going on. I'll try not to be too loquacious and keep you too long, but I care about this topic and I care about what we're discussing today. So if I go a little bit long, I'll ask your forgiveness in advance. So, you know, my view of what the conservative movement should be about is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. I think that we should fight for the right of every American to live a good life in the country they call their own, to raise a family in dignity on a single middle-class job. It's a simple vision that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to live a good life in this country that is your own, that was built by your grandparents and parents, that will be inherited by your children. Now, it's of course more complicated in some ways than it sounds. I think that requires that we respect our history in order to give that to people, so that people are anchored in the traditions of this country, so that they can teach their children those traditions, and so they can pass off a feeling of rootedness in their own community. That's why, of course, we worry about the assault on our history in our schools. I think it requires that we give our children and ourselves the right to speak openly and participate meaningfully in this democratic society of ours. That's why we worry so much about censorship, whether it comes from the government or whether it comes from the big corporations. I think that it requires that we live and have work that has dignity and is meaningful. That's why we worry about our trade and economic policies, so that the people who do work hard and play by the rules actually have good jobs there to employ them. It's why we worry about our foreign policy, so that we don't send people to wars that have no connection to our national interest and end up depleting our country of its most useful resource, the young men and women who fight for our military. All of these things, all of the battles that we fight, as complicated as they are, affect and implicate this question of whether we're enabling the people, the citizens of this country, to live a good life in their own nation. Now, I happen to believe that the biggest obstacle to this, the biggest obstacle to accomplishing this vision is woke capital, which of course is the topic of conversation today. And I believe that those of us on the right need to wake up to what's really going on, because in practice, we have lost, and I hate to sound cynical, I think I'm just being realistic, we have lost nearly every institution in this country that actually matters. We've lost the academy, we have lost the media, we have now lost the government, and we have lost the business and financial institutions too. That's what woke capital is really about. If we're trying to define this term and understand what it means, it's rooted in the fact that the biggest businesses, the most powerful institutions, the most powerful banks in this country have aligned themselves against us. Now that is an obvious fact. You see it in a number of ways. A couple of years ago, one of my most frustrating, or one of the things I've been most frustrated about in American politics is when Stacey Abrams said about a Georgia abortion restriction a couple of years ago that this was a bad bill because it was bad for business. That was the argument of our new corporate neoliberal class. And she was right. And this is something those of us on the right have to accept, is that when the big corporations come against you for passing abortion restrictions, when corporations are so desperate for cheap labor that they don't want people to parent children, she's right to say that abortion restrictions are bad for business. And what that means for those of us who want to protect the dignity of the unborn is that we should be for abortion restrictions, even if they are bad for business. We should support the dignity of human life, even if it means the corporate class doesn't like it. That is a simple and unavoidable fact of the era that we find ourselves in. But I think no moment illustrated what woke capital meant for our country than the riots last summer tied to the Black Lives Matter or BLM movement. Now, we all know the ideology that underpins this movement. We all know what happened. In Minneapolis alone, I believe $13 billion of damage was caused by the riots set off by the Black Lives Matter movement. Woke capital is when the companies and businesses are more invested in a movement like BLM than traditional American principles, and they are. And importantly, if you peel back the onion, what you often find is that the businesses that are most connected and most devoted to destroying our values are also benefiting financially from it. Let me give you just a couple of examples. The insurance companies in Minneapolis who saw billions of wealth, black and white, destroyed by those riots, have consistently underpaid the premiums to the owners of those businesses who had their livelihoods destroyed. In one example, a guy had to pay $140,000 to have the rubble from the business that he built carted off by the city of Minneapolis, and his insurance company reimbursed him to the tune of about $40,000. That's just one example that I read. Now, who was one of the biggest funders of the Black Lives Matter movement? The insurance companies. They avoided the criticism that they weren't paying their own clients for their own damaged property, while at the same time, they were making that damage more likely by funding the movement that was causing it. And increasingly, if you look at the details, if you peel back the onion, this is happening. The best example, of course, is Jeff Bezos, one of the largest funders of the Black Lives Matter movement in this country, to the tune of millions of dollars. Now, who benefits most when small businesses on Main Street are destroyed? Who wants to see their competitors unable to deliver goods and services to people so that you get it delivered in your brown Amazon box? Jeff Bezos. There is a direct connection between woke capital and the plunder that's happening in our society today. The people who are invested in destroying America via our corporate class are also getting rich from it. This is an important piece of the puzzle to understand. Now, why is this happening? I think this is a really important question. I know that we have had some very good conversations today about what's driving it and what's going on. But I want to offer 3 suggestions for what's driving woke capital. I'll try to be brief here. The first is the rise of the digital over the real economy. If you look at the companies that are most woke, that are most aggressively anti-American and anti-conservative, they are the companies that operate in the digital as opposed to the real economy. If you're manufacturing something, if you depend on cheap energy, if you're building something with your hands or employing those who do, if you're shipping goods from one part of the country to another, you are fundamentally less woke than the digital technology oligarchy that's trying to destroy the country. You see this consistently. Now, sometimes, of course, Those companies can be woke too, and sometimes there are some digital technology entrepreneurs who are not woke. But by and large, the digitalization of the American economy is one of the biggest drivers to the American corporate class becoming woke. It's consistent, you see it everywhere, and it's a big problem. A second suggestion, or a second thing that's driving this, is the rise of globalization. So the companies that are most invested in the American nation state, in the people who live here, in the laborers that build and make our goods, those people tend to be far less woke than the people who are employing people overseas, who are more invested and more committed to overseas regimes. Now, I've heard of a banker who was asked by a union leader, don't you worry about all the projects that you're funding that are causing the destruction of American jobs. You're shipping jobs overseas, you're funding the Chinese regime, you're making it easier for the Chinese middle class to rise and harder for the middle class of your own country. And the banker's response was telling, and I think we should take it to heart. He said, I have international shareholders, I have international customers, I have international investors, and I have international clients. I am not an American company. Why do I care about America more than anyone else? That attitude is driving a lot of the woke corporate class. Because when you're invested in American workers, when you depend on American customers, when American consumers have more power over you than the Chinese regime, if your laborers are people in my hometown of Middletown, Ohio, and not Chinese slaves over in China, then you are fundamentally more attached to the American nation state. You can't criticize it in the same way, and you face different incentives. So the rise of globalization, the rise of a new corporate class that's more invested in regimes overseas than in their own country, is another big driver of woke capital. And the final thing I'd point to is that the capital allocators themselves are going woke. This is the third and maybe the most important point that I'll make. All across our country, we have nonprofits, big foundations that are effectively social justice hedge funds. The Ford Foundation has $14 billion in assets under management. Their leadership is serving on many of our corporate boards, and of course the corporate boards of some of our biggest companies are serving as the leadership of the Ford Foundation. The biggest projects that they're investing in are critical race theory. They're investing in the racial division all across our country. They're invested in all of the progressive social causes of the moment. One of the biggest investors to the Black Lives Matter movement that destroyed many of our towns and cities last summer. Now, if I want to sell my house, or if a middle-class American wants to sell their house and they make, say, $200,000 on the sale, they have to pay tax on that $200,000 of money that they made. But if the Ford Foundation sells $200 million of real property in an investment transaction, they pay zero tax, because our public policy has enriched and prioritized the foundations and the nonprofits that are destroying our country. Now, why does this matter? This matters because if you're in my business, I work in venture capital, if you work in private equity, if you're a hedge fund manager, or if you're just a business that needs money to operate your business, you have to go to these people to get the capital to do what you need to do. And of course, the biggest capital allocator, or at least one of the biggest capital allocators in the world, is that woke social justice hedge fund known as Harvard University, which has over $120 billion under management, which funds some of the most destructive ideologies all across our country, which literally trains the next generation of priests in the woke seminary that's dominating our professional class. That university's endowment pays not a dollar of tax. It has no obligation to draw down the principal. It is literally ammunition for the left. And we, through our public policy, have given that endowment more power. Now, this raises the question, of course, what do we do about this? And I don't mean this to be exhaustive. I can't possibly sketch out everything that we have to do on the question of woke capital. But I think there are some obvious solutions, and it should start from a fundamental premise that if you are fighting the American nation state, if you are fighting the values and virtues that make this country great, the conservative movement should be about nothing if not reducing your power and, if necessary, destroying you. We cannot let the people who are driving this country into the ground continue to benefit from special privileges, from tax breaks, from subsidies, and from liability protections. That is the simple rule that we should follow. $120 billion of Harvard University endowment is ammunition for our enemies. And we can't let the enemy have that much ammunition or we're going to lose. It's that simple. This principle should guide all of our policy response. If you cannot go after the pocketbook of these people, if you cannot make them pay, then you are accepting defeat. It's that simple. We're never going to beat them unless we go after them. A few ideas on this front. The first is that we should eliminate all of the special privileges that exist for our nonprofit and foundation class. Why is it that if you're spending all your money to teach literal racism to our children and their schools, why do we give you special tax breaks instead of taxing you more? If we're serious about fighting this problem, why do we give the companies, and by the way, the foundations are used by liberal donors as tax havens for themselves. When Biden raises taxes, they won't pay the brunt of this. They'll give all that money to the foundation. The foundation will use it to push their progressive agenda. They'll be saved from the consequences of the tax increase, even as it will empower institutions that hate us. We need to stop that. The decision to give those foundations and those organizations special privileges is a decision made by public policy. It was made by man, and we can undo it. We just need better public policy and a willingness to actually go after them. We need to reorient our entire economy towards the real economy and not the digital economy. It is striking how much the digital economy dominates in our public policy. To give you just one basic example, there's a high-quality manufacturer in central Ohio that makes natural gas compressors. Their corporate tax rate, like everyone else's, is 21%. Ask them what their effective tax rate is, and they'll tell you it's 21%. The reason is because they can't hide their assets. They can't pretend that their assets exist somewhere else. They're making things in the state of Ohio, employing good Americans in good American jobs to do it. Ask Google or Apple or Facebook what their effective tax rate is, and it's somewhere between 0 and 10% because they can pretend that their digital assets are located overseas. So our very tax code biases the companies that are most invested in the American nation state. That has to stop. We should have a different preference and a different goal. Go after the companies that are destroying this country, reward the companies that are building it. It's that simple. That's what public policy is about. And if we're unwilling to use those levers, we should get out of this business altogether. The globalization point has been beaten to death in the last 5 years, but I'll beat it to death a little bit more because I think it's important. Recall that banker and what he said about his international customers, shareholders, and employees. We should take that person at face value. If that person doesn't believe that he's an American institution or part of an American institution, we should treat him like that. If you are more invested in regimes that hate this country, if you're more invested in workers in slave camps in China than the people in my hometown, no more tax breaks, no more tax cuts. We should be raising their taxes if they're shipping American jobs overseas, not cutting them. That's how you fight them. That's how you fight them at the pocketbook, and that's how you make them pay. It's that simple. Globalization was a choice. It was a choice that we made to make it cheaper to hire Chinese slaves than American workers. It's not cheaper for our country. It's not cheaper for the people suffering from heroin overdose deaths at record numbers in our country, or for the millions of children growing up without fathers in the home. We made the choice to destroy our communities. We let the Chinese do this. It was our elite's fault, and only public policy is going to fix that problem. A lot of other things out there. I think it's important to go after the human resources bureaucracy, of course. If you are actively teaching racism in American schools, in American corporations, if you're creating a hostile work environment because you have to tell everybody that they need to deconstruct their privilege or they need to sacrifice or repent of their whiteness, then you're committing what should be a violation of the law in this country, and people should be able to sue you. We have used the human rights bureaucracy to enforce critical race theory on our corporate class we could use it to enforce the opposite. Again, we just have to be willing to use the power that's been given to us and go after these companies where it actually hurts. I'll say one final thing, and then I'll let all of you get out of here. I'm a realist, but I'm also very hopeful about this country because we have a constitution, and we have a constitutional republic created by that constitution, and that gives the people, that gives us the power to fight back against woke capital. Every time, and I get so annoyed at this, that I see congressional Republicans haul Google or Facebook or Amazon or whoever it is before their committees. They whine at them, they complain at them, they criticize their practices, but we're so unwilling as a movement to actually do anything. It's not enough to tell Google, you're being bad. Clearly, they don't stop being bad. We have to punish them for being bad. If they're going to keep on fighting against us, then we have to fight against them. That's simple. We have to be willing to use the power granted to us by our constitutional republic. I'm reminded of one of my favorite quotes. It's an Abraham Lincoln quote from 1862, of course, at a period in this country that was much darker than the one that we confront today. The fiery trials through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. It may not be as bad as it was in the 1860s, but we're all going through a fiery trial. The people in this room are the people who are going to be at the vanguard of a conservative movement that actually fights back against our enemies instead of just taking it. Now, I was the butt of criticism made in the high-quality conservative journal called The Dispatch. I'm not sure if it was Goldberg or David French that criticized me, but the criticism was, you, J.D. Vance, are too willing to use the means of the left. You want to accomplish a totally different vision of society, but you're willing to use the means that they're willing to use. And I think about that quote, my friends, it's so revealing of how so much of the establishment conservative movement thinks. Because if our enemies are using guns and bazookas, we damn well better fight back with more than wet noodles. We need to use the same means if we're actually going to win this fight. And I'm not in this to lose, I'm in this to win. But this is our country. The people of this country, whether they know it or not, they depend on the institutions of the conservative movement to accomplish their objectives, to serve their interests, to make this country the sort of place where a good guy, working hard and playing by the rules, can raise his family as he sees fit on a single middle-class wage. That's our vision, and it's up to the people in this room to accomplish it. So I remind you of Lincoln's words, we have the power in this country. We have the power in this constitutional republic, and we bear the responsibility to use it to save this country. Let's get to work. Thank you.